Every day people walk into fog and come out the other side. It's normal, expected. But hidden in police files, pilot reports, and witness statements are cases where this simple act went impossibly wrong. People who stepped into mist and emerged somewhere they couldn't be. Others who vanished completely, leaving behind only questions that investigators still can't answer. These aren't urban legends or internet stories. They're documented incidents with official reports, multiple witnesses, and evidence that defies explanation. From pilots who flew through electronic fog and landed decades in the future, to entire crews who disappeared from ships found floating empty in calm seas. Amelia Earhart's final flight. The radio crackled to life at exactly 2:45 in the morning on July the 2nd, 1937. Chief radio man Leo Bellartz jerked awake in his cramped quarters aboard the Coast Guard cutter at Tasca, floating in the dark Pacific waters near Howland Island. After hours of static silence, he finally heard the voice he'd been waiting for. "This is Amelia Earhart," came the transmission, crystal clear through the atmospheric interference. "We're approximately 200 meters out. Everything is fine." Bell quickly adjusted his headset and reached for his logbook. At 30 years old, he'd handled countless radio communications during his Coast Guard service. But this was different. This was Amelia Earhart, the most famous aviator in the world, attempting to become the first woman to fly around the globe. And he was her lifeline. The Itasca had been stationed at Howland Island for weeks preparing for this moment. The tiny coral atoll, barely 2 miles long and half a mile wide, sat isolated in the vast Pacific like a grain of sand on an endless beach. It was supposed to be her heart's refueling stop before the final leg to Hawaii. Everything had been planned down to the minute. Her voice was strong and confident, Bellartz would later recall. You could hear the engine noise in the background, steady and reassuring. I remember thinking this was going to work out just fine. On Howland Island itself, Navy radio Frank Cipriani hunched over his direction-finding equipment in the makeshift radio shack. The 24-year-old had been specially assigned to help guide Earhart's Lockheed Electra to the island using radio bearings. As dawn approached, he strained to catch every transmission, knowing that without his readings, the silver plane could pass right by the tiny island in the endless ocean. At 6:14 a.m., Earhart's voice came through again, this time with the first hint of concern. "We are flying at 1,000 FT, she reported. "Overcast sky, we've been unable to reach you by radio." Bellartz felt his stomach tighten. They were receiving her transmissions clearly, but somehow their responses weren't getting through. He grabbed the microphone and began broadcasting weather updates and position information, not knowing if his words were disappearing into the static. The morning sun was climbing higher when the next transmission arrived at 7:42 a.m. This time, both Bellartz and Cipriani heard something different in her heart's voice. "We are circling but cannot hear you," she said. "Go ahead on 7,500 kiloicals, either now or on the scheduled time on half hour." Bellartz exchanged worried glances with his fellow radio operators. Circling meant she was lost in the vast Pacific with fuel running low. Circling was the last thing any pilot wanted to be doing. On Howland Island, Cipriani frantically worked his direction-finding equipment, but each time Art transmitted, the signal was too brief for him to get a proper bearing. The transmissions came in short bursts, never long enough for him to triangulate her position and guide her home. "I could hear the engine noise changing." Cipriani later told investigators, "The pitch was different. You learn to recognize when an aircraft is in trouble and something wasn't right." At 8:43 a.m., the last confirmed transmission reached both men simultaneously. Hart's voice, now noticeably strained, crackled through their headphones with words that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. "We're on the line, 157-337 running north and south." Bellartz grabbed his pencil and scribbled down the Cabarro ordinates. Line 157-337 was a position line that ran directly through Howland Island. She was close, maybe just minutes away from safety. But then she added something that made his blood run cold. "We're running north and south." That meant she was flying parallel to the island, not toward it. Somehow, in the vast Pacific, she had arrived at exactly the right position, but was flying in the wrong direction. It was like finding the right street, but not knowing which way to turn. "Gas is running low," came her final words, barely audible through the static. Belelots immediately began broadcasting landing instructions, weather updates, anything that might help. But the radio had fallen silent. He called her name repeatedly. "Kak, this is USCG Tasker. Do you read?" Only empty static answered. Minutes stretched into hours. Japani kept his equipment powered up, sweeping the frequencies, hoping for one more transmission. Belarts maintained constant watch, broadcasting blind calls into the void. The sun climbed higher over the Pacific, and still nothing. By noon, it became clear that something impossible had happened. Amelia Heehart, flying in clear conditions with plenty of fuel to reach safety, had simply vanished. Her voice had been strong and clear just hours before. Her position had been correct. The weather was perfect. Every piece of technology had been working properly. She was right there, Bell told the rescue teams that arrived later. Her last transmission was the loudest and clearest we'd received. That means she was close, maybe just a few miles away. Planes don't just disappear when they're that close to land. The search began immediately. Ships and aircraft scoured thousands of square miles of ocean. They found nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, no trace of the silver Lockheed Electra that had been so tantalizingly close to safety just hours before. Cipriani spent the next several days on Howland Island maintaining radio watch and helping coordinate the search. "Every night I'd lie awake replaying those transmissions in my head," he later said, "trying to figure out what we missed, what we could have done different." But the truth is, everything worked exactly as it was supposed to. She was where she was supposed to be when she was supposed to be there, and then she just wasn't. The official investigation would later conclude that her heart and her navigator, Fred Nan, had simply run out of fuel and crashed into the Pacific. But the men who heard her final transmissions knew something else. Her voice had been calm and professional right up until the end. Her position reports had been accurate. There had been no distress call, no indication of mechanical failure, no sign of panic. Belelots kept the radio logs from that morning for the rest of his life. The handwritten entries documenting each transmission in his careful script. The final entry, logged at 8:45 a.m., simply read, "Signal lost. No further contact." The CAS-2 catamaran mystery. Stretching over 1,400 meters along Australia's northeast coast, the Great Barrier Reef is more than just the world's largest coral system. It's a maritime graveyard that has claimed vessels for centuries, earning its reputation as one of the most treacherous waterways on Earth. The razor-sharp coral formations that make this ecosystem so beautiful have torn the hulls from nearly 900 ships since European exploration began. The reef's history reads like a catalogue of maritime disasters. In the 1791 HMS Pandora, chasing the infamous bounty mutineers, struck the coral and sank with the loss of 35 lives. The SS Gothenburg went down in 1875, taking 112 passengers and crew to their deaths. The passenger steamer SS Yongala vanished completely in 1911 during a cyclone. All 122 souls aboard lost without a single survivor or distress signal. Her wreck wasn't found for 47 years, but these waters hold more than just shipwrecks. They harbor mysteries that defy explanation. Vessels have been found drifting empty in perfect condition. Experienced sailors have vanished without trace from boats that show no signs of struggle or accident. The reef seems to swallow people whole, leaving behind only questions and perfectly preserved evidence of lives interrupted mid-moment. The morning of April 18, 2007, started like any other for the crew of the Coast Watch, surveillance helicopter patrolling the waters near the Great Barrier Reef. Flying their routine circuit about 88 nautical miles off the Queensland coast, they spotted something unusual floating in the calm blue waters below. A white catamaran, maybe 40 ft long, drifted aimlessly in the gentle swells. The helicopter circled lower for a better look. The boat appeared to be in perfect condition. No obvious damage, no distress signals flying, but something felt wrong. In these busy shipping lanes, pleasure craft didn't usually drift alone without radio contact or visible crew. The pilot radioed the Australian Maritime Safety Authority, reporting the abandoned vessel's position. Within hours, rescue boats were racing toward the coordinates, expecting to find sailors in distress. Perhaps mechanical problems or medical emergencies that had left the crew unable to operate their radio. When the rescue team reached the catamaran KS2 that afternoon, they found something that would baffle investigators for years. The 40ft vessel floated peacefully in the calm seas, her twin engines still running smoothly, fuel tanks nearly full. On the table in the main cabin, a laptop computer remained open and powered on. Plates of food sat partially eaten as if the crew had been interrupted mid-meal. The boat showed no signs of struggle, no damage, no indication of rough weather or mechanical failure. Life jackets hung undisturbed in their proper storage compartments. Personal belongings remained neatly arranged in the cabins. The radio worked perfectly. The GPS showed their last recorded position from 3 days earlier, not far from their departure point at Early Beach. But of the three-man crew, there was no trace whatsoever. Derek Batten, the 56-year-old skipper, had extensive sailing experience along the Queensland coast. Brothers Peter and James Tunstead, aged 69 and 63, were accomplished sailor who had made this journey before. All three were Perth residents embarking on what was supposed to be a leisurely sailing trip north to Townsville, a route they knew well. The authorities quickly launched one of the largest maritime search operations in Australian history. Aircraft crisscrossed thousands of square miles of ocean. Ships swept the area with sophisticated sonar equipment. Coastal patrols scoured beaches and islands for any sign of the missing men. They found nothing. No bodies, no debris, no life raft, no emergency equipment missing from the boat. It was as if three experienced sailors had simply evaporated, leaving their perfectly functioning vessel to drift empty in the Pacific. The forensic examination of CAS-2 revealed details that made the mystery even more puzzling. The boat's emergency position indicating radio beacon, which should have activated automatically if the vessel had experienced any distress, remained untriggered. The life raft sat unused in its storage compartment. Even more strange, investigators found a video camera that had been recording when the men disappeared. The footage showed them relaxing on deck in calm weather, talking and laughing with no indication of any problems. The camera had captured their voices just hours before they vanished. Derek Batten could be heard discussing their navigation route, pointing out landmarks along the coast. The Tunstead brothers joked about the perfect sailing conditions and their plans for the next day's journey. The final frames showed calm seas and clear skies with all three men visible and apparently at ease. Then, inexplicably, the recording stopped. Weather records confirmed that conditions had been ideal throughout their journey. No storms, no high winds, no rough seas that might have swept the men overboard. The boat's automatic steering system had been engaged, meaning CAS-2 had continued sailing north on her programmed course for days after her crew disappeared. Local fishing boats and commercial vessels reported seeing the catamaran during those 3 days, sailing normally with no apparent distress signals. Several captains later told investigators they had assumed everything was fine because the boat appeared to be under normal operation. The Queensland coroner's investigation lasted over a year, examining every possible explanation: accident, suicide, murder, medical emergencies, equipment failure. Every theory was explored and ultimately discounted. The three men were experienced sailors who knew these waters intimately. They had proper safety equipment and communication devices. The weather was perfect, the sea calm. Rescue helicopter pilot Michael Errants, who participated in the search, later described the eerie scene. "I've been involved in hundreds of maritime rescues over 20 years. You usually find some clue, some evidence of what happened. A damaged boat, debris in the water, something that tells a story. But Cast 2 was like finding a car on the highway with the engine running and nobody inside. Everything was normal except the people were gone." The Great Barrier Reef had claimed 3 more victims, but this time it left behind a perfectly preserved puzzle. Unlike the dramatic shipwrecks that litter the reef's floor, CAS 2 offered no violent explanation, no obvious cause of disaster, just empty spaces where 3 men should have been, and the endless questions that drift like ghost ships through these ancient, hungry waters. Glenn Miller's Vanishing Act, December 15, 1944. The facts are straightforward and documented in military records. At 1:55 p.m., a UC-64 Norseman aircraft took off from Twinwood Farm Airfield in Bedfordshire, England. On board were 3 men: Major Glenn Miller, America's most beloved band leader, Lieutenant Colonel Norman Basil, and Flight Officer John Morgan, the pilot. Their destination was Paris, where Miller was scheduled to perform for Allied troops. The flight should have taken 2 hours. The aircraft never arrived. No distress signal was ever received. No wreckage was ever found. Major Glenn Miller, whose swing music had lifted the spirits of millions during the darkest days of World War II, had vanished into the grey December sky above the English Channel. The meteorological data from that afternoon tells a precise story. The temperature hovered just above freezing at 34 degrees F. Heavy overcast clouds blanketed the region at 800 F-, with visibility severely limited by fog and drizzle. The barometric pressure was dropping, indicating worsening conditions. These were exactly the kind of marginal weather, conditions that grounded most aircraft across Britain that day. Aviation experts knew that the UC-64A Norseman was particularly vulnerable to a specific hazard in these conditions. The aircraft's single Pratt & Whitney R985 radial engine used a carburetor system that was prone to icing when flying through moisture-laden air at temperatures between 20 and 70 degrees F on December 15th. The atmospheric conditions created a perfect storm for carburetor ice formation. The science of carburetor icing is well understood. As air flows through the carburetor's Venturi system, it accelerates and cools rapidly, sometimes dropping the temperature by as much as 60 degrees. When moisture-laden air encounters this temperature drop, ice crystals form inside the carburetor throat, gradually restricting airflow to the engine. The process is insidious. Power loss occurs gradually at first, then accelerates rapidly as more ice accumulates. Flight Officer John Morgan had logged over a dozen flights across the English Channel in UC-64A aircraft, but aviation records show he had never flown this route in weather conditions like those. Present on December 15th, military flight logs indicate that experienced pilots typically avoided channel crossings in marginal weather, particularly in single-engine aircraft without advanced desing equipment. The UC-64A Norseman carried no radar, no sophisticated navigation aids, and no equipment to combat carburetor icing beyond a basic carburetor heat control. In the heavy, overcast conditions that afternoon, Morgan would have been flying entirely on instruments once he left the English coast. The aircraft's single radio could communicate with ground stations, but no record exists of any transmission from the flight after takeoff. Scientific analysis of the flight path reveals troubling details. To reach Paris, Morgan needed to maintain a southeast heading across 80 miles of open water. In zero visibility conditions, this required precise instrument navigation. However, the UC-64A's basic instruments were susceptible to errors, particularly the magnetic compass, which could be affected by the aircraft's metal components and electrical systems. Aviation accident investigators have reconstructed what most likely happened using established principles of flight, safety and weather science. As the Norseman flew through the moisture-laden air over the channel, ice began forming in the carburetor. The engine's power output gradually decreased, forcing Morgan to push the throttle forward to maintain altitude. This created more ice formation, accelerating the power loss. Simultaneously flying in instrument conditions with limited navigation aids, Morgan may have become spatially disoriented. This phenomenon, known as spatial disorientation, affects even experienced pilots when visual references are lost. The inner ear, which helps maintain balance, can provide false sensations that contradict instrument readings. Many pilots have fatally trusted their physical sensations over their instruments. In these conditions, the mathematics of the flight are unforgiving. UC-64A Norseman with a partially iced carburetor cannot maintain altitude indefinitely. As engine power decreases, the aircraft enters a shallow descent. Over the English Channel, with water temperature near freezing, survival time for anyone in the water would be measured in minutes, not hours. Yet, significant questions remain that science cannot fully answer. Military records show that other aircraft were operating in the same general area that afternoon, including returning bomber formations. Some pilots reported unusual weather phenomena, pockets of clear air surrounded by impenetrable fog, electromagnetic disturbances that affected radio equipment, and visual anomalies that defied explanation. The official investigation completed in 1945 concluded that the aircraft probably crashed in the channel due to weather-related factors. But the file contains witness statements that don't fit the simple weather explanation. Ground. Observers reported seeing a small aircraft flying erratically at low altitude near the French coast hours after Miller's eye. Norsemen should have run out of fuel. Radar operators at Dover recorded unexplained contacts in the channel that appeared and disappeared without following normal flight patterns. More puzzling is the complete absence of any wreckage. The English Channel is heavily traveled and relatively shallow in many areas. Aircraft that crash in these waters typically leave some trace: oil slicks, floating debris, or wreckage that washes ashore. Despite extensive searches involving multiple nations' naval forces, absolutely nothing from Miller's flight was ever recovered. Modern oceanographic analysis suggests that wreckage from a channel crash in December 1944 should have been discovered by now. The tidal patterns, current flows, and seafloor composition have been mapped with precision. Computer models of debris distribution consistently indicate that some trace of the aircraft should have appeared somewhere along the coasts of England, France, or Belgium. The acoustic signature of aircraft crashes has also been studied extensively. When a plane hits water at typical approach speeds, it creates sound waves that travel for miles underwater. The channel was full of Allied shipping in December 1944 with sound detection equipment actively monitoring for German submarines. No vessel reported hearing any sounds consistent with an aircraft impact. Glenn Miller's disappearance stands at the intersection of documented science and enduring mystery. The weather conditions, the aircraft's known vulnerabilities, and the pilot's experience level all support a straightforward explanation of mechanical failure leading to a channel crash. Yet the complete absence of physical evidence, the unusual witness reports, and the atmospheric anomalies recorded that day suggest that something more complex may have occurred in the fog-shrouded skies above one of the world's busiest waterways, the five-masted schooner mystery. The investigation began at exactly 6:30 a.m. on January 31, 1921, when Coast Guard surfman Andrew Gray spotted something unusual during his routine patrol along the treacherous diamond shores of Cape Hatteras. Through the morning mist, he could make out the distinctive silhouette of a five-masted schooner. Hard ground on the outer edge of the shores with all sails set. At 255 ft long, the vessel was massive, clearly a commercial cargo ship that had no business being stranded in these waters. Gray immediately telephoned the Cape Hatteras Coast Guard station. Within an hour, Station Commander Captain James Carlson had assembled a rescue team, but the pounding surf and dangerous shores made any immediate approach impossible. Through binoculars, they could see the ship appeared intact, showing no obvious signs of damage or distress. But something felt wrong. No crew members were visible on deck, and no distress signals had been received. By 10 a.m. that morning, the Coast Guard had identified the vessel as the Carroll A. Daring, a commercial schooner registered out of Bath, Maine. Radio communications with the ship's owners, G.G. Daring Company, revealed alarming information. The Daring had been carrying a crew of 11 men under Captain Willis Wormel on a routine cargo run from Norfolk, Virginia to Rio de Janeiro and back. She should have been returning to Maine with a full crew aboard. The weather finally calmed enough for a boarding party to reach the ship on February 4th, 4 days after the initial sighting. Coast Guard Chief Petty Officer C.P. Brady led the team across the dangerous shores in a small motor launch. What they found when they climbed aboard defied explanation. The ship was completely abandoned. Not a single crew member remained on board. Brady's initial inspection revealed that the vessel was in perfect condition structurally, with no signs of storm damage, fire, or collision. The cargo hold was empty as expected from a return voyage, but the crew's personal belongings had vanished entirely. All lifeboats were missing, along with the ship's navigation equipment, logbooks, and radio apparatus. Most disturbing was the evidence of hasty abandonment. In the galley, Brady found partially prepared meals left on tables, as if the crew had been interrupted during dinner. Clothing hung in crew quarters, but all personal items of value had been removed. The ship's safe had been opened and emptied. Even more puzzling, the anchor chains had been cut, not raised normally, suggesting the crew had departed, and in extreme haste. Within 24 hours of the boarding, Captain Carlson had filed an official report with Coast Guard headquarters in Washington. The case was immediately classified as a potential maritime crime. And by February 8th, the Department of Justice had assigned federal investigators to determine what had happened to 11 missing American seamen. The investigation's first breakthrough came on February 15th, when FBI agents interviewed dock workers in Barbados. Port records showed that the Carroll Daring had made an unscheduled stop there on January the 9th, just 3 weeks before running aground. Several witnesses reported unusual behavior from the crew during their brief stay. Barbados Harbor Master Thomas Johnson provided investigators with a disturbing account. He described how the ship's first mate, Charles Mellon, had approached him privately, claiming that Captain Wormel was ill and acting erratically. Mellon had asked specific questions about local shipping schedules and seemed unusually interested in which vessels were departing for northern ports. The investigation took a darker turn on February 22nd, when agents discovered that Mellon had a criminal record. Further background checks revealed he'd served time for assault and had been dismissed from previous maritime positions for insubordination. Captain Wormel's family told investigators that he had complained about Mullilan's hostile behavior and had considered removing him from the crew. By March 1st, federal investigators had developed their primary theory: mutiny. The evidence suggested that Mellon and possibly other crew members had overpowered Captain Wormel somewhere off the Carolina coast. The mutineers had then deliberately run the ship ground to destroy evidence while escaping in the lifeboats to shore. However, this theory faced immediate challenges. On March 8th, an extensive search of the North Carolina coastline found no trace of the missing lifeboats or any of the 11 crew members. Local authorities interviewed hundreds of coastal residents, but no one reported seeing boats landing or strange men coming ashore. For 11 people to vanish completely from a heavily populated coastline seemed impossible. The investigation expanded on March 15th, when the FBI received reports of similar disappearances along the Atlantic coast. The steamship Hewitt had been found abandoned off New Jersey just days before the Daring discovery. Another vessel, the schooner Vance, had been discovered empty in the same general area. Investigators began to suspect a coordinated piracy operation targeting merchant vessels. This theory gained strength on March 28th, when agents arrested a suspected rum runner named Christopher Columbus Gray in New York. During questioning, Gray claimed knowledge of an organized gang that had been hijacking ships along the coast, but he provided no specific information about the Carroll Daring case. Despite intensive interrogation, No solid evidence connected Gray to the missing crew. The investigation stalled through April and May as leads dried up. Federal agents had interviewed over 200 witnesses, searched thousands of miles of coastline, and followed up on dozens of reported sightings. The official file contained statements from lighthouse keepers, Coast Guard personnel, dock workers, and ship captains, but none provided answers about what had happened to 11 men. On June 20th, investigators received their most promising lead yet. A fisherman named James Barber reported finding personal items washed ashore near Virginia Beach that he believed belonged to the Deering crew, FBI. Agents rushed to examine a waterlogged wallet containing identification papers for Herbert Bates, the ship's engineer. However, forensic examination of the wallet on June 25th raised more questions than answers. The leather showed signs of deliberate damage, as if someone had tried to destroy the contents. More puzzling. The identification papers appeared to have been placed in the wallet after it had been in salt water, not before. Investigators concluded the evidence had been planted. The case officially remained open through 1922, but active investigation ceased on December 31st of that year. The final report filed by lead investigator agent Lawrence Ritchie ran to over 500 pages and included witness statements, physical evidence, and detailed timelines. Its conclusion was stark. Despite exhaustive investigation involving multiple federal agencies, the fate of the Carol Deering's crew remained completely unknown. The investigation had revealed troubling questions that science and law enforcement could not answer. How had 11 experienced seamen vanished without leaving any trace on a heavily trafficked coastline? Why had the ship been found in perfect condition with evidence of hasty abandonment but no signs of violence? Most puzzling of all, why had someone apparently planted false evidence months after the disappearance? The Carol Deering file was transferred to inactive status in the FBI archives, where it remains today, still officially unsolved after more than a century of investigation. Bruce Jernan's electronic fog. It was December 4th, 1970, and I had no reason to think this flight would be any different from the dozens of others I'd made between Androstown Airport in the Bahamas and Palm Beach, Florida. My name is Bruce Jernan, and I've been flying that route regularly for my real estate business. That Friday afternoon, I was piloting my Beechcraft Bonanza A36 with my father, Chuck, and business associate writing as passengers. What started as a routine 75-minute flight would become the most terrifying and impossible experience of my life. We took off from Antris Island at exactly 3:00 p.m. under perfect flying conditions. Clear blue skies stretched endlessly in every direction with light winds and excellent visibility. I'd flown this route so many times I could practically do it with my eyes closed. The plan was simple. Maintain a northwesterly heading for about an hour and 15 minutes, then begin our descent into Palm Beach International Airport. About 15 minutes into the flight, I noticed something unusual ahead of us. A lenticular cloud was forming directly over the Bimini Islands, which was strange because the weather conditions didn't support that type of cloud formation. Lenticular clouds typically form over mountains when strong winds encounter terrain. But here we were over flat ocean with light winds. As we approached the cloud, I could see it was growing rapidly, expanding both horizontally and vertically at an unnatural rate. The cloud appeared to be rotating slowly, creating distinct layers that spiraled around a central core. I'd never seen anything like it in my years of flying. What do you think of that cloud formation? I called back to my passengers. My father leaned forward to look through the windscreen and just shook his head. We were all mesmerized by what we were seeing. The cloud continued to grow as we flew toward it, reaching massive proportions. By the time we were directly underneath, it stretched for miles in every direction, towering thousands of feet above our altitude. The strangest part was its shape. It looked almost artificial, like a giant spiral staircase made of vapor. I made the decision to fly around the cloud rather than through it. Banking to the right, I began a wide detour to avoid what appeared to be severe turbulence within the formation. But as I changed course, the cloud began to change too. It started extending toward us, as if it were reaching out to intercept our flight path. "This doesn't look right," I told my passengers. "I've never seen a cloud behave like this." Within minutes, the cloud had completely surrounded us. We were flying in a narrow corridor between towering walls of what I can only describe as electronic fog. The vapor glowed with an eerie light that seemed to come from within the cloud itself, not from any external source. Our instruments began acting erratically. The compass spun wildly. The artificial horizon tumbled, and our radio crackled with strange static. The walls of the tunnel we were flying through appeared to be contracting, getting narrower with each passing moment. I had no choice but to increase our speed to stay ahead of the closing passage. The fog behind us was moving faster than any natural weather phenomenon I'd ever encountered, pursuing our aircraft like it had intelligence. "We're going to have to punch through this thing," I shouted over the increasing engine noise. The tunnel ahead of us was getting smaller, but I could see what appeared to be an opening maybe 1,000 feet in diameter at the far end. As we approached the opening, something incredible happened. The fog around us began to spin, creating a vortex effect. The walls of the tunnel rotated faster and faster, and I felt the aircraft being pulled forward with tremendous force. Our airspeed indicator showed we were flying much faster than our engine power should have allowed. Then we entered what I can only describe as a time warp. The moment we passed through the opening at the end of the tunnel, everything went completely white. Not just cloudy white, but a brilliant, overwhelming whiteness that seemed to penetrate everything. Our instruments went completely dead. The engine noise disappeared as if we were floating in absolute silence. In that white void, I lost all sense of direction, speed, and time. I couldn't tell if we were flying level, climbing, or diving. The normal sensations of flight had vanished completely. My father and business associate were completely silent, and I wondered if they were experiencing the same disorientation. The whiteness lasted for what felt like several minutes, though I had no way to measure time. Then suddenly, we burst out of the fog into clear blue sky. I immediately checked our position and couldn't believe what I was seeing. According to our instruments, we were directly over Miami Beach, still at our original altitude and airspeed. That was impossible. We should have been at least 30 minutes away from Miami, still over the Bahamas. But there below us was the unmistakable coastline of South Florida. I grabbed the radio and contacted Miami Air Traffic Control. Miami approach, this is Bonanza, November 3124X, requesting vectors to Palm Beach. The controller's response confused me even more. Bonanza 3824X. We show no aircraft at your position on our radar. What is your actual location? I gave him our coordinates based on the landmarks below us. And after a moment, he came back with something that made no sense. 3824X, we have you on radar now, but our logs show you've only been airborne for 28 minutes. Is that correct? 28 minutes. I checked my watch and the aircraft clock. Both confirmed what the controller had said. We had somehow flown from Andros Island to Miami Beach in 28 minutes, a flight that normally took 75 minutes. We had covered the same distance in less than half the usual time, with no increase in our ground speed or engine power. But the impossible part wasn't just the shortened flight time. During the entire experience in the electronic fog, our aircraft had consumed almost no fuel. The fuel gauges showed we had used only the amount of fuel that 28 minutes of flight time would normally require, not the amount needed to cover the distance we'd actually traveled. My father and business associate confirmed everything I had experienced. They had seen the same spiral cloud, felt the same acceleration through the tunnel, and experienced the same white void. None of us could explain what had happened, but we all knew we had encountered something far beyond normal weather or atmospheric condition. When we landed at Palm Beach, I immediately filed a detailed report with the FAA. Ground radar had tracked our aircraft's position throughout the flight, confirming that we had indeed traveled from the Bahamas to Florida in 28 minutes. The radar tape showed our aircraft moving at impossible speeds. then disappearing from radar for several minutes before reappearing over Miami. That experience changed my understanding of what's possible in our world. I've flown thousands of hours since that day, but I've never encountered anything remotely similar to the electronic fog that somehow compressed time and space around our aircraft. Whatever we flew through that afternoon defied every law of physics and aviation that I know. Ms. Munchin's final voyage. Picture a stretch of ocean so treacherous that mariners have whispered about it for centuries. The North Atlantic shipping lanes between Europe and North America represent one of the most dangerous waterways on Earth. Here, where warm Gulf Stream waters collide with frigid Arctic currents, nature creates the perfect storm of hazards. Dense fog banks roll in without warning. Towering icebergs drift south from Greenland, carried by currents into the busiest maritime highways in the world. And beneath the surface, something even more sinister lurks. Massive waves that can appear from nowhere, defying all scientific prediction. This is where the ocean claims its victims with ruthless efficiency. The Titanic met her fate here in 1912, torn apart by ice and human arrogance. The Andrea Doria sank in 1956, swallowed by fog so thick that two ships collided despite having the most advanced radar of their time. Dozens of merchant vessels have simply vanished without explanation, leaving behind only questions and scattered debris. But perhaps no loss in these waters was more shocking than what happened on a December night in 1978, when modern technology and engineering confidence met, something that wasn't supposed to exist. The MS Munchin was not just any cargo ship. Launched in 1972 from the Cockerell shipyard in Belgium, she represented the pinnacle of maritime engineering. At 518 ft long and weighing 15,000 tons, this lash carrier was designed specifically to survive the worst the North Atlantic could deliver. Lash stood for lighter aboard ship, a revolutionary concept where cargo was loaded into floating barges called lighters, then lifted aboard the mothership. This system gave the Munchin extraordinary stability and buoyancy. Her designers had built what they believed was an unsinkable vessel. Multiple watertight compartments could be sealed individually. Advanced pumping systems could handle massive flooding. Her deep draft and low center of gravity made her nearly immune to capsizing. The ship's exceptional flotation capabilities meant she could survive damage that would sink conventional cargo vessels. Maritime experts called her practically unsinkable, words that would prove chillingly prophetic. For 6 years, the Munchin had crossed these dangerous waters without incident. She had weathered severe storms, navigated through ice fields, and delivered her cargo with mechanical precision. Captain Gunther Müller commanded a crew of 28 experienced seamen who knew every inch of their ship. They had complete faith in their vessel's ability to handle whatever nature might throw at them. December the 7th, 1978, the Munchin departed Bremerhaven, Germany, loaded with 83 steel-laden lighters bound for Savannah, Georgia. This was her 62nd Atlantic crossing, a routine voyage on a familiar route. Hidden deep in her cargo hold was something special, a replacement nuclear reactor vessel, head for an American power plant worth millions of dollars. The crew settled into their normal rhythm as the ship pushed west into increasingly rough seas. A massive storm system had been battering the North Atlantic since late November. Weather reports showed winds building to hurricane force with waves reaching 30 ft or higher, but the Munchin had handled worse conditions before. Her captain maintained course and speed, confident in his ship's capabilities. After all, this was exactly the kind of weather she had been designed to conquer. December 12th passed without incident. The ship pushed through mountainous seas, her deep hull cutting through waves that would have crippled smaller vessels. Radio's officer Jörg maintained regular contact with other ships, sharing position reports and weather observations. Everything seemed normal. Then at 5 minutes past midnight on December 13th, Ernst made what would be his final transmission. Speaking to a colleague aboard the cruise ship Caribe over 2,400 meters away, he reported bad weather, and some damage to the Munchen. The radio quality was poor, the signal broken and distorted. Ernst gave their position as 44° north, 24° west, somewhere in the vast emptiness of the mid-Atlantic, because it seemed like routine ship-to-ship chatter. The information wasn't immediately passed to the ship's owners. 3 hours later, everything changed. At 3:10 a.m., distress calls began crackling across the emergency frequencies. The Greek freighter Moran picked up fragments of Morse code, SOS signals, from the Munchen. The Soviet freighter Maria Yamulieva heard them too, as did the German tugboat Titan. The messages were broken, incomplete, transmitted by what seemed to be damaged equipment. But one phrase came through clearly: "Ganzig starboard." Maritime experts would later interpret this as a catastrophic list. The ship tilting 50 degrees to one side, far beyond the angle of no return. Munchkin gave her position as 46 to 15 minutes north, 27 to 30 minutes west, roughly 100 nautical miles from where Ernst had reported just hours earlier. Either the ship had traveled at impossible speed, or something had interfered with their navigation systems. Automatic emergency signals continued broadcasting until 7:34 a.m., then suddenly stopped. No further communication was ever received from the Munchen or any of her 28 crew members. By afternoon, the largest search and rescue operation in North Atlantic history was underway. Aircraft from 4 nations scoured the storm-tossed seas. Nearly 80 ships, merchant vessels, naval units, and specialized rescue craft formed search lines across hundreds of square miles of ocean. The Dutch ocean-going tug Smit Rotterdam became the command center for the operation, her radio room coordinating the movements of an international fleet. For 10 days, the search continued. Vessels fought through hurricane-force winds and towering waves, their crew scanning the horizon for any sign of survivors. They found fishing gear, oil slicks, and floating debris, but nothing from the mansion. Finally, 3 lash barges were discovered, empty and drifting far from where the ship had vanished. One sank before it could be recovered. The other 2 were towed to port, silent witnesses to whatever had befallen their mother ship. On February 16, 1979, 2 months after the disaster, the car carrier Don Carlos discovered a single lifeboat from the Munchen's starboard side. It was the last piece of physical evidence ever recovered. The lifeboat's condition told a terrifying story. The forward mounting block, which had secured it 20 meters above the waterline, showed damage that defied belief. The mounting pins had been bent backward from bow to stern, indicating the boat had been struck by a massive force moving from front to back across the ship. Maritime investigators studied the evidence with growing bewilderment. Whatever had hit the lifeboat with such devastating force had to have reached at least 65 feet above the ocean surface. No normal wave could achieve such height in the open ocean. The damage pattern suggested something had struck the ship from ahead, then swept aft with enormous power. But according to accepted oceanographic science, such waves were statistically impossible in the deep Atlantic. The official investigation struggled to explain what had happened. Weather reports confirmed the severe storm, but nothing that should have threatened a ship of Munchion's size and design. The vessel had been in regular radio contact until the final hours, suggesting no gradual deterioration or flooding. Whatever struck the ship had done so suddenly and with overwhelming force. Theories emerged and were discarded. Equipment failure couldn't explain the catastrophic damage. Human error seemed unlikely given the experienced crew. Even structural failure couldn't account for how quickly the unsinkable ship had been overwhelmed. The investigation finally concluded that some kind of unusual event had occurred, language that satisfied no one but acknowledged the limits of conventional explanation. Years later, as oceanographic science advanced, investigators returned to the Munchen mystery with new understanding. Scientists had discovered that rogue waves, walls of water reaching 80 to 100 ft in height, could indeed form in the deep ocean under specific conditions. These monster waves, once dismissed as sailors' folklore, were now recognized as real phenomena capable of appearing without warning from seemingly normal seas. The revised theory painted a terrifying picture. Sometime after midnight on December 13, 1978, the Munchen was plowing through heavy seas when a wall of water, perhaps 90 feet tall, suddenly loomed out of the darkness ahead. The ship plunged into the wave's trough, and before she could rise, millions of tons of water collapsed across her bow and superstructure. The impact tore away the starboard lifeboat, smashed the bridge windows, and likely killed or injured the officers on watch. With her steering damaged and engines potentially disabled, the Munchen was left helpless in the storm. For perhaps 30 hours, she drifted with a severe list, her crew sending desperate distress calls while fighting to save their ship. The automatic emergency signals continued broadcasting, even as the situation grew hopeless. Finally, another massive wave. Perhaps progressive flooding from the initial damage claimed the vessel entirely. She sank in water over 2 meters deep, taking all 28 souls aboard to a grave that has never been found. But mysteries remain. Why did the ship's position reports differ so dramatically? How did a vessel designed to survive such conditions succumb so quickly? And what really happened during those final hours when automated distress signals continued broadcasting from a ship that may have already been slipping beneath the waves? Deputy Val Johnson's encounter. Sometimes the most compelling mysteries are those told by the most reliable witnesses. In the pre-dawn hours of August 27, 1979, a 35-year-old law enforcement officer would become the center of one of America's most documented UFO encounters. What makes this case different isn't just the physical evidence left behind, but how the same event would be interpreted in completely different ways by everyone who examined it. The witness himself, investigators, scientists, skeptics, and believers would all look at the exact same facts and reach wildly different conclusions. Marshall County Deputy Sheriff Al Johnson had been patrolling the isolated highways of northwestern Minnesota for several years. He knew every back road, every farm, every mile of the flat agricultural landscape that stretched endlessly toward the Canadian border. This was not a man given to flights of fancy or supernatural beliefs. Johnson was a practical, level-headed officer who took his job seriously and had never reported anything unusual during his years of night patrol. On that August night, Johnson was driving south on County Highway 5 when he spotted a bright light hovering near the ground, about 2 1/2 miles away. His first thought was practical. Maybe drug smugglers had flown across the border and either landed or crashed. In this remote area where the nearest house might be miles away, such things were always possible. Johnson turned left onto State Highway 220 to investigate, checking his watch as he did so. It was exactly 1:40 a.m. According to Johnson's account, as he drove toward the light, it suddenly shot directly at his patrol car with impossible speed. He heard the sound of breaking glass, then lost consciousness. When he came to, 39 minutes had passed. His 1977 Ford LTD was sitting at a 90-degree angle across the northbound lane, its front end tilted toward the ditch. The car had somehow traveled 854 FT from where he lost consciousness. At 2:19 a.m., Johnson radioed for help, his voice weak and confused. "Something just hit my car," he told the dispatcher. "I don't know what the hell it was." When backup arrived, they found Johnson sitting in his damaged vehicle, holding his head and complaining of severe eye pain. The car itself told a story that no one could easily explain. The windshield was spiderwebbed with cracks, but in a pattern unlike anything the officers had seen from normal impacts. The left headlight was smashed. Both radio antennas were bent at sharp angles. The car's hood showed a dent, but again in an unusual pattern. Most puzzling of all, both Johnson's wristwatch and the car's clock were running 14 minutes slow, though both had been keeping perfect time before the incident. At Warren Hospital, Dr. William Pinso examined Johnson's eyes and made a disturbing discovery. The deputy was suffering from what appeared to be welder's burns, a kind of injury caused by exposure to intense ultraviolet light. Johnson had no memory of seeing any bright flash that could have caused such damage. Sheriff Dennis Brecky launched an immediate investigation. This was his deputy, a man he trusted completely, reporting something that seemed impossible. Brecky contacted the Federal Aviation Administration and the Air Force. Both confirmed that no aircraft, military or civilian, had been scheduled to fly through that area during the early morning hours of August 27th. No emergency landings had been reported. No crashes had occurred. The Center for UFO Studies in Evanston, Illinois, sent investigator Alan Hendry to examine the case. Henry was known for his methodical scientific approach to UFO reports. He often debunked cases that had seemed impressive at first glance. But after interviewing Johnson extensively and examining the physical evidence, Henry was puzzled. The deputy's account was consistent, detailed, and delivered without any hint of deception. The physical damage to the car defied easy explanation. Henry arranged for experts from Ford Motor Company to examine the patrol car. They concluded that the windshield damage was caused by impact from small stones, but could not explain what force had carried those stones with such velocity. A Honeywell engineer named Roland Wardle conducted electromagnetic testing on the vehicle. His report stated that the antenna damage appeared to result from a high-velocity air blast superimposed on the air movement over the fast-moving car, but he could not identify what might have created such a blast. Most intriguingly, Wardell found evidence of electrical effects on the car. Some of the damage patterns were consistent with exposure to a powerful electromagnetic field. However, he concluded that no single earthly explanation could account for all the different types of damage the vehicle had sustained. The case attracted national attention when Johnson appeared on Good Morning America and other television programs. Newspaper reporters descended on the small town of Warren, Minnesota. Phone calls poured in from around the world. Many callers wanted to share their own UFO experiences with someone they believed would understand. Others called Johnson a liar or attention seeker. For Johnson himself, the attention became a nightmare. His wife Roseanne told reporters that the constant phone calls were disrupting their family life. They had a baby and another child to care for, but the phone never stopped ringing. "It's completely disrupted our family organization," she said. The family eventually moved to Eau Claire, Wisconsin, seeking privacy and a normal life. Skeptics offered alternative explanations for what had happened to Johnson. Some suggested he had fallen asleep while driving and crashed into something mundane, perhaps a fence post or road sign. They theorized that the strange damage pattern could be explained by the specific angle of impact. The missing time, they claimed, was simply the result of unconsciousness following a head injury. Others proposed that Johnson had encountered ball lightning, a rare atmospheric phenomenon that produces fast-moving spheres of electrical energy. Ball lightning could potentially explain the electromagnetic effects on the car, the deputy's eye injuries, and the unusual damage patterns. However, ball lightning typically lasts only seconds, not long enough to account for Johnson's extended unconsciousness and missing time. More cynical skeptics suggested that Johnson had deliberately damaged his own patrol car, perhaps to cover up some other incident or to gain attention. They pointed out that he appeared to benefit from the publicity, making television appearances and becoming something of a local celebrity. However, this theory required believing that Johnson had inflicted painful eye injuries on himself and concocted an elaborate story that he maintained consistently for decades. UFO believers, meanwhile, saw the Johnson case as one of the most compelling encounters on record. Here was a trained law enforcement officer with no history of UFO interest, reporting a close encounter that left behind extensive physical evidence. The case had been thoroughly investigated by both government agencies and independent researchers. No conventional explanation seemed to fit all the facts. They argued that the electromagnetic effects on the car were consistent with UFO encounters reported worldwide. To become 14-minute time discrepancy between Johnson's watch and the Carr's clock suggested some kind of temporal anomaly. The specific pattern of damage to the windshield and antennas indicated a controlled force, not a random impact. Ufologists also noted that Johnson had never claimed to see aliens or spaceships. His account was remarkably restrained. He simply reported seeing a light that approached his car, after which he lost consciousness. This lack of exotic details made his story more credible to many researchers. Government investigators reached no definitive conclusion. The Air Force confirmed that no military aircraft were in the area. The FAA found no record of civilian flights. The various scientific tests revealed unusual damage patterns but no clear cause. Officially, the case remained unexplained. Years later, Johnson rarely spoke about the incident. He'd returned to law enforcement work in Wisconsin and preferred to keep his past private. When occasionally contacted by researchers or journalists, he would confirm the basic facts but decline to speculate about what had happened to him. He had reported what he experienced and left it to others to determine what it meant. The damaged patrol car became a permanent exhibit at the Marshall County Historical Society in Warren, Minnesota. Visitors from around the world come to see the cracked windshield, bent antennas, and other physical evidence from that August night in 1979, Frederick Valenti's final flight. There are moments when a human voice becomes frozen in time, preserved forever in official records, telling a story that defies explanation. On the evening of October 21, 1978, that voice belonged to Frederick Valenti, a 20-year-old pilot whose final radio transmissions would become one of aviation's most haunting mysteries. What makes this case extraordinary is not just what happened, but that we can hear it unfolding in real time through Valenti's own words. Recorded by Melbourne Flight Service as terror and confusion consumed him somewhere over the dark waters of Bath Strait. Melbourne, this is Delta Sierra Juliet. Is there any known traffic below 5,000? The voice was calm, professional. Frederick Valenti was following standard procedure as he flew his Cessna 182 south from Moorabbin Airport toward King Island on what should have been a routine evening flight. At 7:06 p.m., Steve Robbie at Melbourne Flight Service answered his query. No known traffic was operating in the area at that altitude. The airspace around Valentic was supposed to be empty. Delta Sierra Juliet. IAM seems to be a large aircraft below 5,000. For the next 4 1/2 minutes, that professional calm would gradually dissolve into something approaching panic, as Valent described an encounter that aviation experts still cannot explain. His words, captured on tape and preserved in official files, provide a chilling first-person account of something that shouldn't have been possible. Valentish was an eager young man obsessed with aviation. He had applied twice to the Royal Australian Air Force, but was rejected for insufficient education. Still determined to make flying his career, he was studying part-time to become a commercial pilot. Though he had struggled with his exams and had been involved in minor flying incidents, he was a competent pilot with 150 hours of flight time and a night rating that allowed him to fly after dark. Melbourne, this is Delta Sierra Juliet. The aircraft has 4 bright, it seems to me, like landing lights. Melbourne Flight Service asked him to confirm the aircraft type and position, but Valentic was clearly confused. Whatever he was seeing didn't match anything in his training or experience. Delta Sierra Juliet. Melbourne cannot identify the type, but it's got 4 bright landing lights, and it's passed about 1,000 FT above me. It's a large aircraft. The controller remained calm following procedure, asking questions. But Valentic's voice was already showing signs of strain. He reported that the unknown aircraft was approaching him from the east, traveling at high speed. Then came words that would haunt investigators for decades. Delta Sierra Juliet, it seems like he's playing some sort of game. He's flying over me 2-3 times at speeds I could not identify. Valentic was now describing behavior that defied conventional aircraft capabilities. No pilot would engage in such dangerous maneuvers near another aircraft, especially in the growing darkness over water. Yet something was apparently circling his small plane with impossible agility. Melbourne Flight Service asked if the aircraft was military. Valentic replied that he couldn't tell due to its speed. The controller then asked about Air Force activity in the area. But before he could complete his question, Valentic interrupted with growing urgency. Melbourne Delta Sierra Juliet. It's approaching now from due east toward me. Delta Sierra Juliet. It seems to me that he's playing some sort of game. He's flying over me 2-3 times at a speed I could not identify. The repetition in his words suggested a man struggling to process what he was witnessing. His training told him one thing, but his eyes were showing him something else entirely. Fear was creeping into his voice as he tried to maintain the professional radio protocol that had been drilled into every pilot. Delta Sierra Juliet Melbourne, what is your actual level? My level is 412 Al 450. Delta Sierra Juliet, and you confirm you cannot identify the aircraft. Affirmative. Delta Sierra Juliet Melbourne. Can you describe the aircraft? What came next would become one of the most quoted passages in UFO literature. Valentic's voice was now clearly strained as he struggled to find words for something beyond his comprehension. Delta Sierra Juliet Melbourne. As it's flying past, it's a long shape. Cannot identify more than it has such speed. Delta Sierra Juliet before above me again. It's orbiting and it's not an aircraft. Those final 5 words, and it's not an aircraft, would echo through decades of investigation and debate. This was a trained pilot, a man whose life revolved around aviation, stating categorically that what he was observing could not be classified as any known aircraft. Delta Sierra Juliet Melbourne. Can you describe what it's doing right now? Melbourne, it's approaching from the southwest. Delta Sierra Juliet. The engine is rough idling. I've got it set at 2324 and the thing is coughing now. Mechanical problems were adding to Valentic's crisis. His engine was running roughly, though moments earlier it had been operating normally. Was this connected to whatever was circling his aircraft? He was alone over dark water with engine trouble and something in the sky that he couldn't identify or understand. Delta Sierra Juliet Melbourne. Roger. What are your intentions? My intentions are to go to King Island. Melbourne, that strange aircraft is hovering on top of me again. The words hovering on top of me suggested something no conventional aircraft could do. Fixed-wing planes cannot hover. Helicopters could hover. But Valentic had described something much larger and faster than any helicopter. His voice now carried unmistakable fear as he tried to cope with a situation his training had never prepared him for. Delta Sierra Juliet Melbourne. Melbourne. Delta Sierra Juliet. It's hovering and it's not an aircraft. Again, that categorical statement from a pilot who knew aircraft. Whatever was above him defied his understanding of aerodynamics and flight capabilities. The professional pilot who had begun this flight with routine radio calls was now reduced to stating the impossible. Delta Sierra Juliet. Then came the final transmission. Valentic's voice was tight with stress as he made one last attempt to describe his situation to the controller, who was his only link to safety. Melbourne Delta Sierra Juliet. The engine is rough idling and I've got it set at 2324. The thing is, the aircraft it's got a green light and sort of metallic, like it's all shiny on the outside. Those were the last coherent words Frederick Valente would ever speak. What followed was 17 seconds of metallic scraping sounds, unlike anything Melbourne Flight Service had ever heard on their radios. The sounds were mechanical, harsh, almost like metal being torn or ground together. Then silence. Steve Robbie at Melbourne Flight Service tried repeatedly to re-establish contact. Delta Sierra Juliet Melbourne. Delta Sierra Juliet Melbourne. But the radio waves carried only empty static. Frederick Valentic and his Cessna 182 had vanished somewhere over Bath Strait. A massive search and rescue operation began at first light. Military aircraft, civilian planes and ships scoured over 1,000 square miles of ocean. For 4 days, they found nothing.
No wreckage, no oil slick, no emergency signals.
It was as if the aircraft had simply evaporated. 5 years later, a piece of engine cowling from a Cessna 182 washed ashore on Flinders Island. Serial number analysis showed it could have come from Valentik's aircraft, but no other wreckage was ever found. The vast majority of the plane and its pilot remained missing, swallowed by the dark waters of Bass Strait, or transported somewhere beyond human understanding. What makes the Valentik case unique among aviation?
Mysteries is that we have his eyewitness account,
preserved word for word, can hear the progression from routine flight, operations to confusion to fear to his final desperate, attempts to describe something that challenged his reality. His voice tells us this was not a man fabricating a story or seeking attention. This was a pilot encountering something that his training and experience couldn't explain. The 17 seconds of metallic sounds that ended the transmission have never been satisfactorily explained. Audio experts have analyzed the recording, but cannot identify what could have produced such sounds. They don't match any known aircraft noises, radio interference, or equipment malfunction. Like the bright lights and hovering aircraft that Valentik described, the sounds remain a mystery. In his final minutes of recorded contact with the world, Frederick Valentich gave us a first-person account of something impossible. Whether that something was extraterrestrial,
atmospheric, or some unknown phenomenon, we'll likely never know. But his voice,
preserved on tape and in official transcripts, continues to tell his story with an authenticity that no amount of analysis or skepticism has been able to diminish. The SS Orang Medan horror. In the age of digital information and instant communication, it's easy to forget how stories once spread across the world. Before the internet, before television, even before widespread radio, tales of mystery and horror traveled through newspapers, shipping offices, and the conversations of sailors in distant ports. These stories changed with each telling, growing more dramatic, more terrifying, until the truth became buried beneath layers of embellishment. The case of the SS Orang Medan represents perhaps the perfect example of how a maritime mystery can evolve from documented fact into legendary fiction, leaving investigators to separate reality from myth. The documented facts begin in 1940 with newspaper reports in British publications, including the Daily Mirror and Yorkshire Evening Post. Both papers carried an Associated Press story dated Italy, describing a distress call from a steamship called the Urang. Madame, the initial report stated that the vessel had sent an SOS message saying, "Beg ships with shortwave wireless get touch urgent." This was followed by probable second officer dead, other members crew also killed. Disregard medical consultation, SOS urgent assistance warship. According to these early accounts, the ship was located south of the Solomon Islands in the Pacific Ocean. When rescue vessels arrived, they found the Orang Medan listing in the water, with her entire crew dead at their posts. The rescuers had little time to investigate before explosions were heard from within the ship, forcing them to abandon it. They watched as the vessel caught fire and sank into the Pacific, taking whatever secrets it held to the ocean floor. The name itself provides linguistic clues to the mystery.
Orang is the Malay or Indonesian word for man or person, while Medan refers to the largest city on the Indonesian island of Sumatra.
The translation would be man of Medan or person from Medan. This suggests a connection to the Dutch East Indies,
modern-day Indonesia, which was a major shipping region during the 1940s. However,
when investigators attempted to verify these early reports, they encountered immediate problems. No ship named the Orang Medan appeared in Lloyd's shipping register, the definitive record of commercial vessels. Maritime authorities in the Netherlands, which would have been the logical registry for a Dutch vessel, had no record of such a ship. The American vessels mentioned in later versions of the story, including the Silver Star, showed no evidence in their official logs of conducting any rescue operations matching the described events. The story took a dramatic turn in 1948 when it was republished in a Dutch-Indonesian newspaper called Die Octant. This version, attributed to an Italian journalist named Silvio Shirley, contained significant new details that had not appeared in the original 1940 reports. The location shifted from the Solomon Islands to the Straits of Malacca between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. The rescue vessel became the American ship's Silver Star, rather than an unnamed British merchant vessel. Most importantly, Shirley's version introduced the haunting final radio message that would become the centerpiece of the legend. SOS from Orang Medan, we float. All officers, including the captain, dead in chart room and on bridge.
Probably whole of crew dead, I die.
This dramatic final transmission, with its desperate tone and abrupt ending, captured the public imagination in ways the mundane original reports had not. Shirley also added disturbing new details about the condition of the bodies. In his telling, the rescue team found corpses sprawled throughout the ship, all lying on their backs with their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Their eyes were wide open, staring upward, and their mouths gaped as if they had died while screaming. Even the ship's dog was found dead, its face locked in a snarl. The crew showed no visible injuries, no signs of violence or struggle, just the universal mark of absolute terror. Scientific analysis of this scenario reveals several plausible explanations for such deaths. Carbon monoxide poisoning from a malfunctioning boiler system could kill an entire crew without leaving obvious physical trauma. The gas is colorless and odorless, making it impossible to detect until victims begin losing consciousness. Death from carbon monoxide often results in a distinctive cherry red coloration of the skin, but this detail wasn't mentioned in any version of the Orang Maiden story. Another theory involves toxic chemical cargo. During the 1940s, many ships carried hazardous materials with less stringent safety protocols than modern vessels. If the Orang Medan had been transporting substances like potassium cyanide, sulfuric acid, or other industrial chemicals, a leak could have released deadly fumes throughout the ship. Sulfuric acid, also known as oil of vitriol, was commonly shipped during this period and could produce lethal vapors if containers were damaged. Some researchers have suggested that the ship might have been carrying leftover chemical weapons from World War II. The Japanese military had stockpiled various nerve agents in China during the war, and these weapons needed to be disposed of after Japan's surrender. A non-registered vessel transporting such materials in secret could explain both the deadly cargo and the lack of official records. However, no evidence has ever surfaced to support this theory. The explosion and fire that reportedly destroyed the ship also fits certain scientific scenarios. If toxic chemicals were the cause of the crew's death, the same substances could have created conditions for a catastrophic explosion. Sulfuric acid, reacting with seawater, can produce hydrogen gas, which is highly explosive. Other industrial chemicals can become unstable when exposed to heat or moisture, leading to fires that spread rapidly through a ship's cargo holds. Yet, for every scientific explanation, the Orang Medan case presents contradictory evidence that defies conventional analysis. The most significant problem remains the complete absence of any ship by that name in official records. Maritime historian Roy Benton spent years researching the case and could find no evidence that the Orang Medan ever existed as a registered vessel. This absence is particularly troubling because shipping records from the 1940s are generally well preserved and accessible. The inconsistencies in the story's various versions also raise serious questions about its authenticity. The location changes from the Solomon Islands to the Straits of Malacca. The rescue vessels vary from unnamed British ships to the specifically identified American vessel, Silver Star. The dates shift from
1940 to 1947 to 1948. Even
the distress messages differ significantly between
versions. These variations suggest
that the story evolved through multiple retellings rather than being based on a single documented event. The central figure in this evolution appears to be Silvio Shirley, the Italian journalist who expanded the story in 1948. Shirley was based in Trieste, the same city where the original 1940 report was filed. Researchers have discovered that Shirley wrote numerous maritime stories for local newspapers, often emphasizing dramatic and mysterious elements. His version of the Jurang Madan story includes details that read more like fiction than journalism, complete with a sole survivor who provides crucial information before dying. Modern researchers have found that Shirley added a subplot involving a German sailor who supposedly escaped the doomed ship and was later found by an Italian missionary on a remote. Pacifica, this survivor allegedly revealed that the Jurang Madan was carrying improperly stored sulfuric acid that leaked and killed the crew. However, this convenient explanation arrives through a chain of witnesses, the German sailor to the missionary to Shirley, that cannot be independently verified. The complete lack of corroborating evidence extends beyond shipping records. No Coast Guard reports document the incident. No insurance claims were filed for the lost vessel or cargo.
No crew lists exist showing who might have been aboard.
No families ever came forward claiming lost relatives. For a merchant vessel with presumably dozens of crew, members to vanish completely from all official records suggests either a massive cover-up or a fictional origin. Audio and visual evidence that might support the story is also completely absent. In an era when maritime radio communications were routinely logged and preserved, no recordings of the desperate distress calls have ever surfaced.
No photographs of the rescue operation exist.
Despite the fact that ships of this period commonly carried cameras for documenting unusual events, the Jurang Madan story demonstrates how maritime mysteries can take on lives of their own, independent of factual foundation. Each retelling adds new dramatic elements while obscuring the original source. What may have started as a genuine but routine incident, perhaps a ship with engine trouble or a minor medical emergency, evolved through multiple retellings into a supernatural horror story featuring mass death and mysterious explosions. The case also illustrates the challenge of investigating historical mysteries in an era before comprehensive documentation. While modern shipping is extensively tracked and monitored, vessels in the 1940s could operate with minimal oversight, especially in remote Pacific waters during and immediately after World War II. This lack of documentation creates space for legends to flourish. The stories fill the gaps left by absent official records. What remains scientifically intriguing about the Jurang Madan case is not whether the specific events occurred as described, but how the story addresses real maritime hazards of the era. Ships did carry dangerous chemicals with inadequate safety precautions. Toxic gas leaks did kill crews. Vessels did explode and sink with minimal trace. The Jurang Madan legend, whether factual or fictional, accurately reflects the genuine dangers faced by merchant mariners in the post-war Pacific. The mystery also highlights the power of fear and
uncertainty in shaping how we
interpret unexplained events. The image of a ship
full of corpses with terror-stricken
faces touches something human psychology. It suggests that whatever killed these people was so horrifying that it literally scared them to death, leaving behind evidence of their final moments of absolute fear. Scientists continue to study the theoretical aspects of the Jurang Madan case, not to prove its authenticity, but to understand how such an event might occur. Research into toxic gas exposure, maritime chemical accidents, and mass casualty incidents provides insights that extend far beyond any single mysterious ship. The case serves as a template for understanding how human beings might respond to sudden lethal environmental hazards in confined spaces like ships. The Bennington Triangle Vanishings. Deep in the heart of Vermont's Green Mountains lies a place that Native Americans refused to enter. For centuries, the Abenaki, Makin, and Pennock tribes avoided Glastonbury Mountain, warning that the earth itself was cursed. They spoke of rocks that would swallow anyone who stepped on them, dropping victims into the deepest recesses of the earth, never to be seen again. They told stories of bear-like creatures that stalked hunters, trying to follow them home from the mountain slopes. To these indigenous peoples, Glastonbury was suitable only for burying the dead, a place where the living could never thrive. Modern Americans dismissed these warnings as primitive superstition. Yet somehow, every attempt to build civilization on Glastonbury Mountain has failed spectacularly. French trappers established trading posts in the 18th century, only to abandon them within years. English settlers tried twice, creating the towns of Fairville and Glastonbury during the logging boom. Both became ghost towns when the old-growth forests were stripped bare. Even a vacation resort built on the same cursed ground lasted less than a year before shuttering its doors forever. The mountains seemed to actively resist human presence, as if some malevolent force was determined to keep people away. But the most chilling aspect of Glastonbury wasn't its history of failed settlements. It was its habit of making people disappear without explanation. Between 1945 and 1950, 5 individuals would vanish in or around the mountain, creating what author Joe Citro would later call the Bennington Triangle. The most famous of these disappearances involved an 18-year-old college student whose fate would haunt investigators for decades. The long trail runs along Vermont's Green Mountain Ridge for 273 miles from Massachusetts to the Canadian border. It's one of America's oldest long-distance hiking paths,
marked with white blazes and dotted with primitive shelters for overnight camping.
Near the town of Bennington, the trail climbs the slopes of Glastonbury Mountain through dense hardwood forests that turn spectacular shades of orange and red each October. To most hikers, it's simply another beautiful section of Vermont wilderness. But local guides knew better. Ernest Whitman owned a cabin near the Glastonbury section of the Long Trail. He had lived in the area all his life and understood the mountain's temperament. The trails could be confusing, especially for inexperienced hikers. Fog rolled in without warning, turning familiar paths into alien landscapes. Compass readings seemed unreliable in certain areas. Even experienced woodsmen sometimes found themselves disoriented on slopes they thought they knew by heart. On December 1st, 1946, Whitman was working around his cabin when he noticed a young woman hiking alone up the trail. She was wearing jeans, a red parka with a fur collar, and sneakers. Hardly appropriate clothing for a Vermont mountain in early December. The afternoon was already growing cold and temperatures would drop below freezing after sunset. The woman stopped to ask him a question that would echo through the decades. "How far can you go on this trail?" she asked.
"It's 4 mi to the fork," Whitman replied, referring to a junction near the mountain's summit. He looked at her like clothing with concern.
"You might want to think about turning back. It's going to get mighty cold up there." If the young woman replied, Whitman didn't hear her. She continued up the trail, moving with the confident stride of someone who expected to be back down the mountain before dark. It was the last time anyone would see Paula Jean Weldon alive. Paula was a sophomore at Bennington College, an exclusive women's school known for its progressive educational philosophy and artistic programs. She came from an affluent Connecticut family. Her father, Archibald, was a successful architect. Her mother, a socially prominent woman active in charitable organizations. Paula was, by all accounts, a typical college student of her era, neither rebellious nor troubled. She studied hard, made friends easily, and showed no signs of wanting to run away from her comfortable life. 2 weeks earlier, Paula had visited the Long Trail area as part of a bot-class field trip. Perhaps that's when she first developed an interest in exploring the mountain on her own. On that Sunday afternoon, she told her roommate Elizabeth Johnson that she wanted to go for a hike. She put on her red parka and headed out around 2:45 p.m., expecting to be back in time for dinner. Paula hitchhiked to the trailhead, catching a ride with Louis Knapp, a local building contractor who was driving home along Route 67A. Knapp later told police that Paula seemed like a typical college girl, perhaps a bit clumsy as she had tripped climbing into his truck, but otherwise unremarkable. He dropped her off near his driveway on Route 9, about 2 mi from the Long Trail entrance. Paula thanked him and headed up the road toward the mountain. What happened next would be reconstructed from the accounts of several witnesses. A gas station owner saw a young woman matching Paula's description, playfully running up and down a gravel pit. Multiple hikers reported seeing her on the beginning section of the long trail, including Ernest Whitman at his cabin. All described the same details: a young woman in a red parka, hiking alone, inadequately dressed for the conditions. But after Whitman's encounter, Paula Weldon simply vanished. When her roommate realized she hadn't returned by morning, the college president contacted Paula's parents. The news that their daughter was missing hit the Weldons like a physical blow. Mrs. Weldon fainted from shock. Within hours, an impromptu search operation was underway. The search for Paula Weldon revealed just how unprepared Vermont was for such emergencies. The state had no organized police force in 1946, no coordinated search and rescue capabilities. College President Lewis Webster Jones called classes and organized 370 faculty members and students into search parties. They scattered across Glastonbury Mountain in groups of 20, dropping handfuls of confetti to mark areas they had already covered. For days, volunteers combed the mountain. They checked every shelter, every stream, every possible place where an injured hiker might have sought refuge. Aircraft joined the search, circling overhead, while ground teams pushed deeper into the wilderness. A $5,000 reward was offered, an enormous sum in 1946, but despite their efforts, the searchers found nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no sign that Paul Weldon had ever been on the mountain at all. The mystery deepened when investigators discovered that Paula might not have been alone on the mountain that day. A cabin owner reported that 3 men had hiked up the trail around noon on Sunday. They asked him to store a suitcase containing clothing with names written on the labels: J.W. Carroll, William Watts, and M. Golder. The men claimed to be in military service, but gave no explanation for their presence. Like Paula, they were inadequately dressed for a long hike. And like Paula, they never returned for their belongings. Within days, reported sightings of Paula began pouring in from across New England. A waitress in Fall River, Massachusetts, insisted that a young woman matching Paula's description had come into her restaurant with an older man who appeared drunk and angry. The woman had asked how far she was from Bennington, Vermont, and claimed to be out of money. She seemed dazed and confused, according to the waitress, who was certain she recognized Paula from newspaper photograph. Police conducted house-to-house searches in Fall River, but found no trace of the mysterious woman. Other sightings followed: bus stations, restaurants, city streets across the Northeast. Paula's father fielded hundreds of tips, each one raising hopes that his daughter was alive somewhere, perhaps suffering from amnesia or being held against her will. But every lead proved false. Private investigator Raymond Schindler was hired by a Connecticut newspaper to work the case. Schindler was known for his methodical approach and had solved several high-profile disappearances. But after months of investigation, he reluctantly concluded that Paula was almost certainly dead, most likely the victim of foul play. The complete absence of physical evidence suggested that someone had taken great care to hide her body. Yet, the Bennington Triangle wasn't finished claiming victims. In December 1949, James Tedford, a 68-year-old Army veteran, boarded a bus in St. Albans after visiting relatives. He was returning to the Vermont soldiers' home in Bennington. The bus made several stops along the route, and witnesses confirmed that Tedford was aboard as late as Burlington. But when the bus reached its final destination in Bennington, Tedford was nowhere to be found. His belongings remained in his seat, including a bus schedule, but the man himself had vanished completely. October 1950 brought 2 more disappearances within weeks of each other. 8-year-old Paul Jeepson was waiting in his mother's pickup truck at the Bennington town dump when he wandered away. Bloodhounds picked up his scent and followed it to Highway 9, where the trail simply ended in the middle of the road near Glastonbury Mountain. Despite massive search efforts, Paul was never found. Just 2 weeks later, 53-year-old Frida Langanga was camping with family when she slipped into a stream. She told her cousin she would return to camp for dry clothes but never arrived. Frida became the only one of the Bennington Triangle victims whose body was eventually recovered 7 months later, found in an area that had already been thoroughly searched. The cause of death appeared to be accidental drowning, but investigators couldn't explain how she'd ended up where she was found. The pattern seemed clear to local residents, even if authorities couldn't explain it. Glastonbury Mountain was claiming victims with disturbing regularity. The disappearances shared eerie similarities. People vanishing without trace in broad daylight, often with witnesses nearby. Search efforts that should have found at least some evidence turning up nothing. The mountain seemed to swallow people whole, just as the Native American legends had warned. Paula Weldon's case remained the most prominent and puzzling of all the Bennington Triangle disappearances. Unlike the others, she was young, educated, and from a prominent family that could afford extensive search efforts and private investigators. Her story captured national attention, appearing in newspapers and magazines across the country. Television programs featured her case, keeping her disappearance in the public eye for years. The investigation revealed how easily someone could become lost on Glastonbury Mountain, even under seemingly simple conditions. A modern hiker named Robert Singley experienced this firsthand in 2008 when he attempted to retrace Paula's route. Despite being an experienced outdoorsman, Singley became completely disoriented. What should have been a short-day hike turned into an overnight ordeal. When he was finally found by state police, he described a terrifying experience of losing all sense of direction and time. Right before I lost the trail, everything crescendoed into this weird sort of dizzying confusion. Singley recalled, "It just suddenly got dark and then it was like, where am I? What's going on?"
I was totally lost. During his night in the forest, he found shelter under a large maple tree that seemed to radiate what he described as a weird, haunting energy.
When he passed the same tree the next morning, it looked completely different, and the trail was now littered with obstacles he couldn't have missed on his way up. Scientific explanations exist for some of the Bennington Triangle phenomena. The area's geography creates microclimates that can produce sudden fog banks and temperature changes. Dense forest canopy can block GPS signals and interfere with compass readings. Hypothermia can set in quickly when hikers get wet in cold weather, causing disorientation and poor decision M. The psychological stress of being lost can trigger panic responses that make people hide from rescuers or wander even further from safety. But rational explanations struggle to account for all the strange elements of the Bennington Triangle cases. The complete absence of physical evidence in most disappearances defies statistical probability. The clustering of vanishings in a specific time period and location suggests something beyond random chance. And the ongoing reports of disorientation and unusual experiences on the mountain continue to this day, keeping the legend alive in the minds of hikers and local residents. Paula Weldon's disappearance led directly to the creation of Vermont State Police Force in July 1947. Her case demonstrated the need for coordinated law enforcement resources that could respond effectively to missing person reports. Ironically, it was this same state police force that eventually found Robert Singley when he became lost on the same mountain 60 years later, possibly saving him from joining the list of Bennington Triangle victims. The Glastonbury section of the Long Trail remains popular with hikers today, though many who walk its paths report feeling an indefinable sense of unease. The forest is beautiful but somehow foreboding, filled with shadows that seem deeper than they should be. Fog can roll in without warning, transforming familiar landmarks into alien shapes. Even experienced hikers sometimes find themselves questioning their navigation skills and wondering if the trails have somehow changed since their last visit. Modern search and rescue techniques might have found Paula Weldon in 1946 with GPS tracking, thermal imaging and coordinated helicopter searches, but the mountain keeps its secrets well. And even today, people occasionally go missing in the Bennington Triangle, though none with the same level of media attention that Paula's case received. The Native American warnings about cursed ground seem less like superstition and more like ancient wisdom passed down through generations who understood that some places are simply not meant for human habitation. Travis Walton's 5 Days Gone. The human mind craves consistency. When multiple people witness the same event, we expect them to tell the same story. When they don't, we assume someone is lying. But what happens when 6 men all tell the same impossible story? When their accounts remain consistent for decades despite relentless scrutiny? When they pass polygraph tests but still face accusations of deception? The Travis Walton case presents one of the most puzzling scenarios in the history of unexplained disappearances. A story where the witnesses themselves become as much a mystery as the event they claim to have witnessed. On November 5, 1975, 7 men were driving home from a logging job in Arizona's Apache Site Greaves National Forest. Mike Rogers led the crew that included Kenneth Peterson, John Goulet, Steve Pierce, Alan Dallas, Dwayne Smith, and 22-year-old Travis Walton. They had spent the day thinning trees, working behind schedule on a Forest Service contract that Rogers desperately needed to complete on time. As darkness fell, they packed their tools into Rogers's pickup truck for the ride back to the small town of Snowflake. What happened next would tear apart their quiet lives and divide their community for decades to come. But depending on who tells the story, the events of that November evening represent either compelling evidence of extraterrestrial contact or an elaborate hoax perpetrated by desperate men facing financial ruin. The 6 co-workers who lived to tell their tale paint a picture of terror and confusion. As they drove along a forest road, they spotted an unusual light through the trees. Rogers pulled the truck closer to investigate, and they all saw what appeared to be a large disc-shaped craft hovering about 15 ft above a clearing. The object was golden in color and glowing with an inner light that illuminated the surrounding pines. Against the desperate shouts of his companions, Travis Walton jumped from the truck and ran toward the craft. As he approached, a blue-green beam of light struck him, lifting him off the ground and throwing him backward. The other men, convinced they had just watched their friend die, fled in panic. When they finally gathered enough courage to return 20 minutes later, both Walton and the craft had vanished without a trace. Mike Rogers, the crew chief, found himself thrust into the role of primary witness and spokesman for the group. A soft-spoken man who had never sought publicity, Rogers faced intense scrutiny from law enforcement, media, and UFO investigators. His account never wavered from the basic facts. They had seen a craft. Travis had approached it. A beam of light had struck him and he had disappeared. "I know what I saw," Rogers would tell investigators repeatedly. "I didn't want to believe it myself, but I can't deny what happened. Travis got hit by some kind of energy beam and just vanished. We all saw it happen." Rogers' certainty came at a personal cost. The stress of the investigation caused him to lose weight and develop health problems. His relationship with his family suffered as reporters and curiosity seekers invaded their privacy. Kenneth Peterson, the youngest crew member at 19, supported Rogers' account, but struggled with the psychological aftermath. "People look at you different when you say you've seen a UFO," Peterson later recalled. "They think you're crazy or lying, but I know what I saw that night. And it wasn't from this world." The teenager had to deal with skeptical parents and classmates who mocked his story, forcing him to withdraw from his normal social circle. John Goulet, Alan Diss, Steve Pierce, and Dwayne Smith all corroborated the basic details, though each remembered slightly different aspects of the encounter. This variation in minor details actually supported their credibility to some investigators, since coached witnesses typically tell identical stories. All 6 men described the same sequence of events: spotting the light, approaching the craft, watching Travis run toward it, seeing him struck by the beam, and fleeing in terror. Law enforcement officials found themselves dealing with a case unlike anything in their experience. Navajo County Sheriff Marlon Gillespie initially suspected that the men had murdered Walton and concocted the UFO story to cover their crime. The timing seemed suspicious. Rogers was facing financial penalties for delays on his logging contract, and several crew members owed Walton money. My first thought was that they had killed Travis over money or some dispute and made up this crazy story, Gillespie admitted years later. But the more I investigated, the less sense that theory made. These men were genuinely terrified. They weren't acting like killers trying to cover up a crime. Deputy Sheriff Chuck Ellison, who conducted many of the initial interviews, found the witnesses' emotional state compelling. I've questioned a lot of suspects over the years, and these guys weren't behaving like people who had committed murder, Ellison recalled. They were scared, confused, and genuinely seemed to believe what they were telling us. The investigation took an unprecedented turn when all 6 witnesses agreed to take polygraph tests. Arizona Department of Public Safety examiner Cy Gilson administered the tests on November 10th, 5 days after Walton's disappearance. The results were stunning. All 6 men passed, showing no indication of deception when they described seeing a UFO and watching their friend get struck by a beam of light. Gilson, a veteran examiner with over 20 years of experience, was impressed by the results. The polygraph chart showed these men were telling the truth as they understood it, he reported. In my professional opinion, they honestly believe they witnessed the events they described. However, Gilson was careful to note that the polygraph couldn't verify whether what they saw was actually extraterrestrial in origin. While law enforcement was testing the witnesses, UFO investigators were conducting their own inquiries. The Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, APRO, led by Jim and Coral Lorenzen, dispatched investigators
to Arizona within days of the disappearance. They
interviewed the witnesses extensively and found their accounts credible and consistent. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, a prominent astronomer and UFO researcher, also became involved in the case. Heck had previously served as scientific consultant to the Air Force's Project Blue Book and was known for his methodical approach to UFO investigations. After reviewing the evidence, Hynek concluded that the Walton case represented one of the most compelling abduction reports he had encountered. The multiple witness testimony combined with the polygraph results makes this case extremely difficult to dismiss. Hynek wrote in his case files, "While I cannot say definitively that an extraterrestrial event occurred, I can find no conventional explanation that adequately accounts for all the evidence." However, not all investigators reached the same conclusion. Philip Klass, a prominent UFO skeptic and electrical engineer, launched his own investigation and reached dramatically different conclusions. Klass believed the entire incident was an elaborate hoax designed to help Rogers avoid financial penalties on his logging contract. According to Klass's theory, Rogers and his crew are facing significant financial losses due to delays on their Forest Service contract. The UFO story provided them with a dramatic excuse for missing work while simultaneously opening the possibility of profiting from book deals and media appearances. Klass pointed to inconsistencies in witness statements and questioned the reliability of the polygraph tests. These men had strong financial motives to fabricate this story. Klass argued the polygraph tests were administered under questionable conditions and the witnesses had 5 days to coordinate their stories before Walton reappeared. Klass spent years researching the case and published his findings in several books, maintaining that the incident was a carefully planned deception. Ground Saucer Watch, another UFO investigation group, sided with Klass's skeptical assessment. They conducted computer analysis of photographs allegedly showing the UFO and concluded they were hoaxed. GSW Director William Spaulding accused Walton and the witnesses of perpetrating a fraud for financial gain. The case took another dramatic turn when Travis Walton reappeared 5 days after his disappearance. On November 10th, Walton called his sister from a payphone in Hebra, Arizona, claiming to have no clear memory of where he had been. He was found by his brother-in-law in a disoriented state, wearing the same clothes he had on when he vanished. Walton's own account of his experience added new layers of complexity to the case. He claimed to have awakened aboard an alien spacecraft where he encountered several types of extraterrestrial beings. His descriptions were detailed and vivid, including technical aspects of the ship's interior and the appearance of his captors. However, Walton admitted that much of his memory was fragmented and unclear. When Walton was administered his own polygraph test, the results were more controversial than those of his co-workers. The first test, conducted by an examiner hired by the National Enquirer, indicated deception in some of his responses. However, a subsequent test, administered by a different examiner, showed no signs of deception. This discrepancy fueled further debate about the case's authenticity. Dr. Howard Candle, who examined Walton after his return, found no physical evidence of his claimed abduction. Walton showed no signs of malnutrition or exposure that would be expected from 5 days in the wilderness. However, he did appear genuinely disoriented and emotionally distressed, leading some medical professionals to conclude he had experienced significant psychological trauma. Family members provided conflicting perspectives on Walton's credibility. His mother and siblings generally supported his story, noting that he'd never been known to lie or seek attention. However, some relatives expressed private doubts about the more exotic aspects of his account, while maintaining their belief that something unusual had occurred. The local community was sharply divided in their reactions to the case. Snowflake was a small, conservative Mormon town where most residents had never encountered anything like the Walton story. Some community members rallied around the witnesses, offering support and defending their character. Others viewed the incident as an embarrassment that brought unwanted attention to their quiet town. Business owners found themselves dealing with an influx of reporters, investigators, and curiosity seekers. Some welcomed the tourism revenue, while others complained that the UFO story was hurting the community's reputation. The controversy created lasting divisions among neighbors and friends, who took opposing sides on the case's authenticity. Religious leaders in the predominantly Mormon community struggled with how to address the incident. Some viewed it as potentially demonic in nature, while others suggested it might represent a test of faith. The variety of religious interpretations added another layer of complexity to community discussions about the case. Media coverage of the Walton incident varied dramatically depending on the outlet. Tabloid newspapers like the National Enquirer sensationalized the story with dramatic headlines and speculative reporting. More mainstream news sources approached it with skepticism, often emphasizing the lack of physical evidence and the financial motive suggested by critics. Television programs featured the case prominently with documentaries, presenting both believer and skeptic perspectives. The 1993 movie Fire in the Sky brought renewed attention to the case, though many critics noted that the film took significant dramatic liberties with the actual events. The long-term impact on the witnesses has been profound and varied. Some have embraced their role in UFO history, participating in conferences and interviews decades after the incident. Others have largely withdrawn from public attention, tired of the constant scrutiny and controversy surrounding their experience. Mike Rogers eventually recanted his support for Walton's abduction claims, though he maintained that they had genuinely seen something
unusual in the forest that night. This
change of position created additional controversy and raised new questions about what actually occurred. In 1975, Steve Pierce, one of the younger crew members, has given contradictory statements over the years, sometimes supporting and sometimes questioning the official story. His changing positions reflect the complex pressures faced by witnesses in high-profile, unexplained cases. The scientific community has largely dismissed the Walton case due to the lack of physical evidence and the numerous inconsistencies that have emerged over time. However, some researchers continue to view it as worthy of serious study. particularly the initial witness testimony and polygraph results. Psychological studies of the case have focused on group dynamics and the possibility of shared delusions or false memories. Some researchers suggest that the witnesses may have genuinely believed they saw something unusual while misinterpreting natural phenomena or experiencing collective psychological effects. The Walton case illustrates how the same set of facts can support
radically different interpretations.
Depending on one's worldview and investigative approach, believers point to the consistent witness testimony, polygraph results, and absence of conventional explanations. Skeptics emphasize the financial motives, lack of physical evidence, and various inconsistencies that have emerged over time. The Philadelphia experiment. Some mysteries begin not with an event, but with a letter, a single piece of correspondence that arrives unexpectedly, carrying claims so extraordinary that they challenge everything we think we know about reality. On January 13, 1956, astronomer and UFO researcher Morris K. Jessup opened his mail to find just such a letter. Written in peculiar handwriting and signed by someone calling himself Carlos Allende, it would launch one of the most investigated and controversial cases in modern paranormal research. What followed was a decade-long investigation that would span multiple government agencies, involve mysterious deaths, and ultimately raise more questions than it
answered about what the United
States Navy might have accomplished in a Philadelphia shipyard during World War II. The story began with the publication of Morris Jessup's book, The Case for the UFO. Jessup was a respected astronomer who had worked at observatories in South Africa and South America before turning his attention to unidentified flying objects. His book proposed that UFOs were extraterrestrial vehicles that had been visiting Earth for centuries. It was a serious academic treatment of the subject filled with scientific analysis and historical research. Shortly after publication, Jessup received his first letter from Carlos Allende. Written from New Kensington, Pennsylvania, the letter was rambling and difficult to follow, filled with unusual capitalization and strange punctuation. But buried within the confused prose were specific claims about a secret Navy experiment conducted in 1943 at the Philadelphia Naval Yard. Allende's second letter was more focused and infinitely more disturbing. He claimed to have witnessed an experiment where the Navy had achieved what scientists thought impossible, making a 306 FT destroyer escort completely invisible to both radar and the naked eye. The ship in question was the USS Eldridge, and according to Allende, he had watched the entire event unfold from the deck of a nearby merchant vessel. In his letter, Allende described how the Eldridge had been surrounded by a greenish fog before vanishing entirely. When it reappeared moments later, some crew members were allegedly embedded in the ship's metal hull, while others had gone completely insane. The experiment had been based on Einstein's unified field theory, Allende claimed, though he offered no explanation for how he might have access to such classified information. Jessup was initially skeptical, but intrigued by the specific details in Allende's account. The letter writer demonstrated knowledge of naval terminology and procedures that suggested some military experience. More troubling was Allende's claim that he could provide witnesses, other sailors who had seen the experiment from their own vessels. Jessup began his own investigation, writing back to Allende, requesting more information and proof of his claims. He contacted Navy records offices trying to verify details about the USS Eldridge and any unusual experiments conducted in Philadelphia during 1943. The official response was uniformly negative. No such experiments had been conducted, and the ship's logs showed routine convoy duty during the time period in question. But N's responses became increasingly erratic. He claimed that most of the witnesses had died under mysterious circumstances, and those still alive were too frightened to come forward. He provided a few names, but warned Jessup not to contact them directly, saying it would put their lives in danger. Meanwhile, Jessup had shared N's letters with colleagues in the UFO research community. Most dismissed them as the fantasies of a disturbed individual, but a few found elements of the story compelling enough to warrant further investigation. The case took a bizarre turn when someone mailed a copy of Jessup's UFO book to the Office of Naval Research in Washington, D.C. The book was filled with handwritten annotations in 3 different colors of ink, apparently representing comments from 3 different individuals. The annotations demonstrated detailed knowledge of advanced physics and contained references to the Philadelphia experiment. The comments were written in a style similar to Allende's letters, but seemed to come from multiple sources. They referred to different types of extraterrestrial beings and their methods
of space travel. Most disturbing were specific
references to the Navy's supposed invisibility experiments and their catastrophic effects on human test subjects. Commander George Hoover at the Office of Naval Research was sufficiently intrigued to launch a quiet investigation. He had the annotations analyzed by handwriting experts and began checking military records for any classified research that might relate to the claims. The Navy's investigation uncovered some troubling correlations. While no direct evidence of invisibility experiments existed, there had indeed been extensive research into electromagnetic dehaussing systems designed to protect ships from magnetic mines. The USS Eldridge had been equipped with such systems, and testing had been conducted at the Philadelphia Naval Yard. More concerning was the discovery that several of the technical details mentioned in the annotated book were accurate. The anonymous commentators demonstrated knowledge of classified research projects and naval procedures that should not have been available to civilians. Commander Hoover contacted Morris Jessup, requesting a meeting to discuss the annotated book and its possible sources. Jessup agreed, traveling to Washington for what he assumed would be a routine interview. Following their meeting with Jessup, Navy officials made an unprecedented decision. They contracted with the Verero Manufacturing Corporation of Garland, Texas, to produce a limited edition reproduction of the annotated book. Only 127 copies of what became known as the Varro edition were printed, distributed exclusively to military research facilities and selected scientists. The Navy's rationale for this unusual step remains unclear. Official statements suggested they wanted to preserve the annotations for further study, but critics suspected a more sinister motive. Some researchers believe the Navy was trying to identify the source of the leaked information by monitoring who showed interest in the reproduced book. Jessup was provided with 2 copies of the Varro edition, but was reportedly disturbed by the Navy's intense interest in what he had assumed was simply an elaborate hoax. He began to suspect that his correspondence with Allende had somehow connected him to genuinely classified information. On the same day the Varro edition was completed, Morris Jessup was found dead in his car in a Miami park. The official cause of death was suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. Jessup had attached a hose to his car's exhaust pipe and sealed himself inside the vehicle. The timing was extraordinary and suspicious. Jessup had been scheduled to meet with friends that evening and had left no suicide note. His death came just as the Navy's investigation into the Philadelphia experiment claims was reaching its peak. Dr. Manson Valentine, a close friend of Jessup's, discovered the body and immediately suspected foul play. Valentine noted that Jessup had seemed optimistic about his research in recent weeks and had shown no signs of depression or suicidal ideation. The physicist Ivan Sanderson, another colleague, reported that Jessup had recently spoken of being followed and had expressed fears for his safety. With Jessup's death, the investigation into the Philadelphia experiment claims lost its primary civilian researcher. The Navy quietly closed its official inquiry, concluding that the annotated book was the work of at least one individual with a comprehensive knowledge of the theory and application of electromagnetic phenomena. Carlos Allende, meanwhile, had disappeared. Letters to his last known address were returned undelivered, and efforts to locate him through military records proved unsuccessful. It was as if the man who had started the entire mystery had simply evaporated. The USS Eldridge's official logs were reviewed once more, showing routine escort duty in 1943 with no indication of unusual experiments. Veterans who had served aboard the ship were interviewed, but none recalled anything resembling the events Allende had described. 10 years after Jessup's death, researcher Robert German made a breakthrough in the case. Through extensive investigation, he identified Carlos Allende as Carl Meredith Allen, a Pennsylvania man with a history of mental illness and elaborate storytelling. German located Allen, living in a trailer park, and interviewed him extensively. Allen admitted to fabricating the Philadelphia experiment story, claiming he had been inspired by a combination of science fiction novels and his own fragmented memories of naval service during World War II. According to Allen, he'd never witnessed any invisibility experiments. The detailed technical information in his letters had been gleaned from popular science magazines and his own imagination. He expressed surprise that anyone had taken his claims seriously, saying he had intended them as a form of entertainment. Despite Allen's confession, questions remained about the annotated book that had so interested the Navy. Handwriting experts compared the annotations with samples of Allen's writing and found significant differences. The annotations appeared to be the work of multiple individuals, not a single person. Further analysis suggested that at least one of the annotators had extensive knowledge of advanced physics and electromagnetic theory. The level of technical sophistication exceeded what Allen could have reasonably possessed, leading some researchers to conclude that the annotations represented genuine leaked information from classified research projects. The Philadelphia experiment gained renewed attention with the release of a Hollywood movie based on the alleged events. The film took significant dramatic liberties with the story, but introduced the legend to a new generation of believers and skeptics. The movie's success prompted fresh investigations into the case. Researchers uncovered additional documents suggesting that the Navy had indeed conducted electromagnetic research during World War II, though nothing approaching the dramatic invisibility experiments described by Allende. The Navy released a comprehensive report on the Philadelphia experiment claims, systematically debunking each element of the story. The USS Eldridge's complete service record was made public, showing that the ship had never been in Philadelphia during the time period when the experiment supposedly occurred. The report explained that degassing experiments had been conducted on various ships, but these involved adjusting electromagnetic fields to protect against magnetic mines, not achieving invisibility. No personnel had been injured in these routine procedures, and no unusual phenomena had been observed. Despite the official debunking, the Philadelphia experiment case continued to raise disturbing questions about the Navy's initial response. Why had the Office of Naval Research taken Carlos Allen's clearly unstable claims seriously enough to launch an investigation? Why had they contracted for reproduction of the annotated book? And why had Morris Jessup died under suspicious circumstances just as the investigation was reaching its climax? Some researchers suggested that the Navy's interest stemmed not from belief in invisibility experiments, but from concern about security leaks. The technical accuracy of some annotations may have indicated that classified information was being disseminated through unofficial channels. Others proposed that the Philadelphia experiment story had been deliberately created or encouraged as a disinformation campaign designed to discredit legitimate researchers who were getting too close to genuine classified projects. Modern researchers have used Freedom of Information Act requests to obtain additional documents related to the Philadelphia experiment investigation. While most material has been heavily redacted, the released papers confirm that the Navy devoted significant resources to investigating Allende's claims. The most intriguing discovery has been evidence that the Office of Naval Research continued monitoring Philadelphia experiment researchers for years after the official investigation ended. Surveillance files exist on numerous civilians who had expressed interest in the case, suggesting that the Navy remained concerned about potential security implications long after dismissing the core claims. The Carlos Allende letters, the annotated book, the Navy's investigation, and Morris Jessup's suspicious death created a timeline of events that continues to puzzle researchers more than 60 years later. What began as the rambling letters of an apparently disturbed individual escalated into a government investigation that may have cost a respected scientist his life. The Dyatlov Pass incident. In the study of unexplained phenomena, few cases generate as much scientific interest as those that combine documented physical evidence with seemingly impossible circumstances. The Dyatlov Pass incident represents exactly this type of challenge. A mystery supported by autopsy reports, crime scene photographs, and witness testimony, yet featuring elements that have defied rational explanation for over 60 years. On February 1, 1959, 9 experienced hikers died in Russia's Ural mountains under circumstances so bizarre that Soviet investigators could only conclude that a compelling natural force had caused their deaths. The case has since become a perfect laboratory for testing the boundaries between scientific explanation and enduring mystery. The documented facts begin with a hiking expedition led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student at the Ural Polytechnical Institute. His team consisted of 8 fellow students and 1 recent graduate, all experienced winter hikers attempting to reach a Taurton mountain in the northern Urals. This was not a casual adventure, but a serious expedition requiring approval from the university's sports club and detailed route planning through some of Russia's most challenging wilderness. On January 27th, the group took a train and bus to reach the village of Vizai, their last contact with the civilization. Local. Many people warned them about the mountain they intended to climb, whose name, Salat Cycle, meant dead mountain in their language. According to indigenous tradition, the mountain was cursed and should never be approached by thaliving. The hikers dismissed these warnings as primitive superstition and continued with their planned route. The last confirmed sighting of the group occurred on January 28th when they hired a truck driver to take them. Further north toward the mountain, the ATL had arranged to send a telegraph to the university's sports club by February 12th, confirming their safe return. When no message arrived, search operations began on February 20th. What rescuers would discover over the following months would challenge every assumption about survival, death, and the forces of nature. The tent was found on February 26th, pitched on an exposed slope of Holot Cycle at an elevation of 3,500 ft. The location defied basic mountaineering logic. Experienced hikers would never camp on such an exposed windswept slope when sheltered positions were available nearby. More puzzling was the condition of the tent itself. It had been cut open from the inside with multiple slashes, as if the occupants had desperately tried to escape through the walls rather than using the entrance. Inside the tent, investigators found the hikers' belongings neatly arranged, including boots, warm clothing, and cameras with exposed film that would later be developed. Most of the group's food remained uneaten, and there were no signs of struggle or violence within the shelter. However, footprints in the snow told a disturbing story. 9 sets of tracks led away from the tent down the slope toward a tree-line over a mile away. Some prints showed bare feet or feet wearing only socks, while others indicated the hikers were walking single file through deep snow. The first 2 bodies were discovered on February 27th, found beneath a large cedar tree at the forest's edge. Yuri Kryonko and Yuri Doroshenko were dressed only in underwear despite outside temperatures of 25° F. The hands showed evidence of desperate climbing with bark and skin found under their fingernails. Branches on the cedar tree had been broken off to a height of 15 ft, suggesting someone had climbed up, possibly trying to see back toward the tent or look for approaching danger. Between the cedar tree and the tent, searchers found 3 more bodies. Igor Dyatlov was discovered in a position suggesting he had been trying to return to the tent. Zenida Kulmagorova was found 2,000 ft from the cedar tree, and Rustam Slodin lay between her and Dyatlov. All 3 appeared to have died from hypothermia, though Slobodin had a small fracture to his skull. The remaining 4 bodies weren't found until May, when melting snow revealed them in a ravine 250 ft from the cedar tree. These discoveries would transform the incident from a tragic hiking accident into one of forensic science's most baffling mysteries. The bodies of Leuda Dubinina, Seon Zolitario, Alexander Kvatouv, and Nicolas Thibault Brinol showed catastrophic internal injuries that seemed impossible given their circumstances. Dubinina had multiple rib fractures and massive chest trauma. Zolitario suffered similar chest injuries with broken ribs. Thibault Brinol had severe skull damage. The force required to cause such injuries was enormous. The medical examiner compared it to the impact of a car crash, yet the bodies showed no external wounds, bruising, or signs of struggle. The violence was purely internal, as if some tremendous force had crushed them from within. Even more disturbing were the missing body parts. Dubinina was found without her tongue, eyes, and part of her lips. Zolitario was also missing his eyes. The medical examiner could offer no explanation for these losses, noting that the missing tissues appeared to have been removed rather than decomposed naturally. Scientific analysis of the evidence has produced several competing theories, each attempting to explain different aspects of the mystery. The avalanche hypothesis gained significant support in 2021, when Swiss researchers Yang Gao and Alexander Busrin published a study in Nature Communications, proposing a delayed avalanche mechanism. According to their analysis, the hikers had cut into the slope to create a flat camping surface, weakening the snowpack above them. Strong katabatic winds then deposited additional snow on the unstable slope throughout the night. After approximately 9 hours, this extra weight triggered a small slab.
Avalanche that struck the tent with tremendous
force. Computer simulations showed that even a relatively small avalanche could generate enough pressure to cause the severe chest injuries found on 4 victims. The researchers calculated that snow blocks weighing 50 to 100 kilo and traveling at 6 FTS could produce thoracic compression. Consistent with the autopsy findings, this mechanism would explain both the internal injuries and the hikers' desperate escape from the tent. The avalanche theory also addresses several previously unexplained elements of the case. The hikers' decision to cut through their tent rather than use the entrance makes sense if they were being buried by falling snow and debris. Their inadequate clothing suggests they escaped in extreme haste, prioritizing speed over warmth. The lack of avalanche debris when the tent was found 3 weeks later could be explained by subsequent snowfall and wind redistribution. However, other scientific explanations focus on the atmospheric conditions present that night. Meteorological records show that a severe weather front had moved through the area, bringing extreme cold and powerful winds. Some researchers proposed that katabatic winds, dense cold air flowing downhill at high speed, could have created conditions that made staying in the tent impossible. Katabatic winds can reach speeds of over 100 meters and create localized pressure changes that might explain the tent damage. The psychological effects of extreme wind exposure, including infrasound, low-frequency sound waves below the range of human hearing, have been linked to feelings of panic, dread, and disorientation. Infrasound can be produced by strong winds interacting with mountain topography and may have triggered irrational fear responses in the hikers. The radioactivity found on some clothing items has been explained through scientific analysis of the local environment. The Ural Mountains contain natural uranium deposits, and some of the hikers had previously worked in nuclear facilities. The levels of radiation detected were low and consistent with naturally occurring background radiation or occupational exposure, not the massive contamination that would result from a nuclear accident or weapons test. The missing eyes and tongue have scientific precedence in forensic pathology. Bodies found in running water, as the 4 severely injured hikers were, commonly show damage to soft tissues and facial features. Small scavenging animals preferentially consume eyes, tongues, and lips because these tissues are easily accessible and rich in nutrients. the bodies weren't discovered until 3 months after death, providing ample time for decomposition and animal activity. Yet, despite decades of scientific investigation, significant mysteries remain. The decision to camp on an exposed slope contradicts everything known about the group's mountaineering experience. None of them were novices who might make such a basic survival error. Weather records don't show conditions severe enough to force experienced hikers to abandon proper shelter procedures. The specific pattern of injuries among the 4 bodies found in the ravine defies easy explanation. If an avalanche caused their trauma, why didn't all 9 hikers suffer similar injuries? The 5 bodies found earlier showed only hypothermia-related deaths. This suggests that whatever caused the devastating internal injuries affected only a specific group, not the entire party. The photographs recovered from the hikers' cameras show their final day proceeding normally. The last images, taken just before sunset on February 1st, show the group setting up their tent and preparing for the evening. The hikers appear relaxed and confident, giving no indication they were aware of any approaching danger. One photograph shows them digging into the slope to create a level camping platform. Exactly the action that avalanche researchers now believe triggered their deaths. Some images from the recovered film remain controversial. Several photographs show bright lights or orbs in the night sky. Though these could be explained by camera malfunctions, light leaks in damaged film, or natural atmospheric phenomena, the lights reported by search teams and other witnesses in the area during February 1959 might represent bull lightning, St. Elmo's fire, or military rocket tests conducted at a facility 300 meters south of the incident site. Modern recreations of the hikers' final night have provided additional insights into the incident's scientific aspects. In 2019, a Swedish-Russian expedition retraced the group's route and camped at the same location. They experienced severe katabatic winds that made sleeping impossible and forced them to abandon their campsite. However, the expedition members were able to evacuate in an orderly fashion, unlike the panicked escape that apparently claimed the Dietluf group. The psychological elements of the case remain equally puzzling. Why did 9 experienced hikers make a series of seemingly irrational decisions that led to their deaths? If they fled the tent in panic, why didn't they return once they reached the safety of the forest? The evidence suggests they built a fire, climbed trees to observe the tent area, and made organized attempts to survive. This indicates rational thinking, not the complete panic that would explain their initial flight. Forensic analysis of the hikers' behavior patterns suggests they divided into 2 groups after reaching the cedar tree. Some attempted to return to the tent for supplies, while others tried to build shelter in the ravine. This division of effort implies leadership and strategic thinking, qualities that make their initial abandonment of the tent even more mysterious. The time sequence of events also raises scientific questions. The last photographs were taken around sunset on February 1st. The hikers' watches stopped at different times throughout the night, suggesting they died at intervals rather than simultaneously. This gradual timeline contradicts theories involving a single catastrophic event, like a massive avalanche or explosion. Recent advances in forensic science have allowed re-examination of some physical evidence from the case. Computer modeling of the hikers' injuries suggests they were caused by high-velocity impact rather than crushing pressure. This finding supports theories involving avalanche debris or falling objects, but contradicts explanations based on atmospheric pressure or infrasound effects. DNA analysis of fabric and tissue samples has confirmed the identity of all 9 hikers and ruled out the presence of unknown individuals at the site. Chemical analysis of the radioactive clothing confirmed it was consistent with occupational exposure or natural background radiation, not weapons testing or nuclear accidents. The Dietluf Pass incident demonstrates both the power and limitations of scientific investigation. Modern research has successfully explained many previously mysterious elements of the case. From the internal injuries to the missing body parts to the radioactive contamination, computer simulations can model how a delayed avalanche might have created the exact conditions found at the scene. Yet, science struggles to explain the human decision that initiated the tragedy. Why did experienced mountaineers choose such a dangerous campsite? What force was powerful enough to drive them from their shelter into deadly cold? The avalanche theory requires them to have felt, threatened enough to cut through their tent and flee immediately. But small slab avalanches typically give plenty of warning before failure, the missing 411 phenomenon. America's national parks stretch across millions of acres of wilderness. From the ancient peaks of the Appalachians to the towering granite walls of Usaid, these protected lands draw millions of visitors each year, seeking solitude in nature's grandest cathedrals. Most return home with nothing more than memories and photographs, but hidden within the park service files are cases that defy explanation. People who stepped into the wilderness and simply vanished, leaving behind patterns so strange that one former police detective has dedicated his life to understanding them. In 2008, David Poliez was a retired police investigator when a park ranger approached him with disturbing information. The ranger spoke of unusual disappearances in national parks, cases that didn't follow normal patterns of people getting lost. Poliez had spent years investigating complex criminal cases, but what the ranger described was unlike anything in his experience. People were vanishing under circumstances that made no logical sense. Poliez began requesting files from the National Park Service through the Freedom of Information Act. What he discovered were clusters of disappearances concentrated in specific geographical areas. These weren't random incidents scattered across the vast wilderness. They were focused hotspots where people repeatedly vanished under similar, impossible conditions. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park became one of his primary research areas. This ancient mountain range straddling Tennessee and North Carolina holds more than its share of mysteries. The Cherokee called these peaks the land of blue smoke for the natural haze that clings to the ridge lines. But modern visitors have encountered something far more troubling than atmospheric mist. On June 14, 1969, 6-year-old Dennis Martin was camping with his family at Spencefield in the Great Smokies. The boy was playing hide-and-seek with other children around the campsite. His father, William Martin, watched as Dennis ran behind a group of trees to hide from his friends. The distance was less than 100 wide. Dennis never emerged from those trees. The search for Dennis Martin became the largest rescue operation in National Park Service history. More than 1,400 people combed the mountains for weeks. Helicopters, bloodhounds, and expert trackers found nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no trace of the boy. The Tennessee National Guard joined the effort. The FBI investigated. Still nothing. What made Dennis Martin's case particularly disturbing were the details that emerged during the search. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a man carrying something over his shoulder through the woods shortly after Dennis vanished. Park officials dismissed these sightings. The boy's father noticed a foul smell in the area where Dennis disappeared, an odor that searchers couldn't identify or locate. Weather conditions were perfect that day. Dennis was a healthy, active child familiar with camping. He disappeared in broad daylight within shouting distance of adults. Every conventional explanation failed to account for his complete vanishing. The Dennis Martin case fits a pattern that polls would later identify across multiple national parks. Children disappearing in impossible circumstances.
Massive search efforts finding no trace.
Strange details that official reports minimize or ignore. Usaid National Park in California presented another cluster of mysterious vanishings. The park's granite cliffs and deep valleys have drawn visitors for generations, but they've also claimed people in ways that challenge understanding. 14-year-old Stacy Ann Arras loved photography and hiking. On July 17, 1981, she was camping with her father near Sunrise High Sierra Camp in Usaid's backcountry. That morning, Stacy set off alone to photograph the area around their campsite. Her father watched her walk toward a small ridge. She carried her camera and was wearing bright clothing that should have been visible for miles in the clear mountain air. Stacy never returned to camp. Her father searched the immediate area before alerting park rangers. Search teams arrived within hours. They found no footprints beyond the point where her father last saw her. No disturbed vegetation, no sign that she had been in the area at all. The search for Stacy Aris continued for weeks. Helicopters equipped with infrared sensors scanned the terrain. Expert trackers studied every inch of ground. Searchers called her name continuously, listening for any response. The silence was complete. What puzzled investigators was the total absence of evidence. Stacy had simply stepped behind a small hill and vanished as if she'd never existed. Her camera was never found.
No piece of clothing, no disturbed earth where she might have fallen.
The search area was relatively small and well-defined find, yet it yielded nothing. Years later, David Pides would identify Usite as one of the most active areas for these mysterious disappearances. The park's combination of granite terrain and complex topography seemed to create conditions where people could vanish completely. The Pacific Northwest presented its own troubling patterns. In 1999, 3-year-old Jared Atadero was hiking the Big South Trail in Colorado's Roosevelt National Forest with a church group. The trail was well maintained and relatively easy, winding through forest alongside the Pudra River. Jared was walking with the group when he suddenly ran ahead on the trail. Adult supervisors called for him to wait, but the boy had already disappeared around a bend. When they reached that spot moments later, Jared was gone. The trail at that location was bordered by dense forest on one side and a steep drop to the river on the other. There was nowhere to go except forward or back on the trail. Yet Jared had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed him. Search teams scoured the area for days. The river was shallow and clear, offering no place for a small body to hide. The forest was thick, but not impossible. Dogs tracked Jared's scent to a certain point on the trail, then lost it entirely. It was as if the boy had simply stopped existing at that exact location. 4 years later, hikers found small pieces of clothing and a tooth in the same area. The items were identified as belonging to Jared, but their location made no sense. They were found far from where he had disappeared in terrain that a 3-year-old could never have reached alone. Pides identified several consistent factors in these disappearances. Many involved children or young adults. They occurred in good weather conditions. The missing person was often just out of sight of companions for a few moments. Massive search efforts yielded no trace. When remains were eventually found, they appeared in locations that defied logical explanation. The geographical clustering was equally significant. Certain areas seemed to generate disappearances repeatedly over decades. The Great Smoky Mountains, Usite, the Olympic Peninsula, parts of Colorado and Montana. These weren't random incidents, but concentrated phenomena affecting specific locations. Weather played a curious role in many cases. Police noted that disappearances often occurred just before storms moved into an area. Rain would begin shortly after someone vanished, washing away any potential evidence. The timing seemed too consistent to be coincidental. In 2015, 2-year-old Dior Kun Jr. was camping with his family near Leodora, Idaho. The boy was playing near their campsite at Timber Creek Campground while adults prepared lunch. His parents watched him constantly in the small, open area. For just a few minutes, their attention was diverted to organizing camping gear. When they looked back, Dior was gone. The campground was surrounded by dense forest, but there were no paths leading away from the site. The creek was shallow and slow-moving. There was nowhere for a toddler to hide or fall. Search teams arrived within an hour. They found no footprints leading away from the campsite, no disturbed ground, no indication that Dior had wandered into the forest. Dogs tracked his scent in circles around the campsite, then lost it completely. The Dior CS case developed complications that made it even more puzzling. Initial investigations focused on the family, but no evidence of wrongdoing was ever found. The boy had simply vanished from a controlled environment under constant supervision. Pides documented over 1,400 similar cases across North America. The numbers represented a phenomenon that official agencies seemed reluctant to acknowledge. Park Service statistics listed these disappearances as isolated incidents, but Polly's research revealed patterns that suggested something far more systematic. The investigation techniques that had served Pides during his police career proved valuable in analyzing these cases. He looked for connections, commonalities, and geographic clusters. What emerged was a picture of disappearances following rules that conventional search and rescue couldn't explain. Certain environmental factors appeared repeatedly in the cases. Granite bedrock was present in many disappearance locations. Bodies of water were often nearby. Weather changes frequently occurred around the time people vanished. The missing persons often had German or English ancestry. The berry connection was particularly striking. Many people disappeared while picking berries or in areas where berries were abundant. Pallas found this pattern across multiple states and decades. The seasonal timing often coincided with berry harvests. National parks maintain their own missing persons databases, but accessing detailed information proved difficult. Politus encountered resistance when requesting files, even through official channels. Some parks claimed they didn't maintain centralized records of disappearances. Others released heavily redacted documents that obscured crucial details. The lack of cooperation from official agencies became part of the mystery itself. Why would parks be reluctant to share information about missing persons? What was being hidden in those redacted files? Modern technology has brought new tools to search and rescue operations, but the mysterious disappearances continue. GPS devices, cell phones, and satellite communication haven't prevented people from vanishing completely. If anything, the technology has made the disappearances more puzzling by eliminating traditional explanations. The missing 411 phenomenon extends beyond individual tragedies to reveal something deeply unsettling about places we consider safe and well understood. These national parks, preserved as sanctuaries of natural beauty, harbor mysteries that challenge our assumptions about how the world works. David Pietz continues his research, adding new cases to his database while searching for answers that remain frustratingly elusive. Each disappearance follows patterns that seem impossible, yet the documentation is undeniable. People walk into America's most beautiful landscapes and vanish as if stepping through doorways to nowhere. The families left behind face a particularly cruel uncertainty. Without bodies or clear evidence of what happened, they cannot grieve properly or find closure. They are left with questions that have no answers, and authorities who seem more interested in maintaining public confidence than solving mysteries. The Crater Lake Mysteries. Deep in the Oregon Cascades sits a lake so impossibly blue it seems painted against the landscape. Crater Lake rests within the collapsed remains of an ancient mountain, its waters reaching depths that swallow light itself. Scientists have studied this volcanic caldera for over a century, mapping its geological secrets and measuring its hidden forces. Yet, for all their instruments and expertise, Crater Lake continues to generate phenomena that challenge rational explanation. The lake exists because of one of North America's most violent geological events. 7,700 years ago, Mount Mazama stood 12,000 ft tall, dominating the Cascade Range. The mountain had been building for 400,000 years. Layer upon layer of volcanic eruptions, creating a massive strat-volcano. Then, in a catastrophic eruption lasting only days, the entire peak collapsed into its own magma chamber. The eruption ejected 12 cub-miles of material into the atmosphere. Ash from Mount Mazama has been found as far away as Alberta, Canada. The pyrolastic flows that raced down the mountain slopes traveled at speeds exceeding 100 minutes, incinerating everything in their path. When the violence ended, a crater, 6 mi wide and nearly a mile deep, marked where the mountain had stood. Over the following centuries, snowmelt and rainfall slowly filled the caldera. Crater Lake reached its current depth of 1,943 ft, making it the deepest lake in the United States and the 9th deepest in the world. The water has no outlets, maintaining its level through a delicate balance of precipitation and evaporation. This closed system has created water of extraordinary purity and the intense blue color that gives the lake its otherworldly appearance. United States Geological Survey teams have spent decades studying Crater Lake's formation and ongoing geological processes. Their research has revealed a complex system still showing signs of volcanic activity. Deep beneath the lake's surface, hydrothermal vents release heated water and gases from the underlying magma chamber. Temperature measurements have detected warm zones on the lake bottom, indicating continued geothermal activity. The geological surveys have documented specific locations where water temperatures rise significantly above the lake's normal near-freezing levels. These thermal features cluster around areas where the collapsed mountain structure remains unstable. Scientists can explain these temperature variations through standard volcanic processes. Yet the patterns don't always match their theoretical models. Seismic monitoring stations around Crater Lake record regular earthquake activity. Most tremors are minor, consistent with the settling of the collapsed caldera structure. However, some seismic events display unusual characteristics that don't fit standard earthquake patterns. These anomalous readings occur in clusters, often coinciding with reports of strange phenomena around the lake. The most scientifically documented mystery at Crater Lake is the Old Man of the lake. This 30-foot tree stump has been floating
vertically in the lake's waters since at least
1896, when it was first photographed by early surveyors. The hemlock trunk moves around the lake in patterns that scientists have tried to explain through wind and current analysis. Researchers have studied the Old Man's movements for over a century. The stump floats with only about 4 ft visible above the water's surface. Its movements don't follow predictable patterns based on wind direction or seasonal changes. Sometimes it travels in straight lines across miles of water. Other times, it remains stationary for weeks in perfectly calm conditions. The wood itself presents a puzzle. After more than a century floating in water, the Old Man shows little decay. Laboratory analysis of similar wood samples suggests it should have disintegrated decades ago. The preservation is so remarkable that some researchers have theorized about unique chemical properties in crater lakes, water that might slow decomposition. Temperature monitoring around the Old Man has revealed localized warm spots in the water near the floating stump. These thermal readings don't correlate with known hydrothermal vents or other geological features. The warm zones appear and disappear without apparent cause, sometimes following the stump's movements around the lake. Scientific expeditions have used sonar mapping to study Crater Lake's underwater topography. These surveys have revealed unusual acoustic signatures from the lake bottom. Some sonar returns indicate structures or formations that don't match the expected volcanic geology. When research teams have attempted to investigate these anomalies with underwater cameras, the equipment often malfunctions or produces unclear imagery. The lake's extreme depth creates unique acoustic properties that researchers have studied extensively. Sound travels differently in Crater Lake's deep, pure water than in typical freshwater environments. However, some acoustic phenomena recorded at the lake don't match these known properties. Underwater microphones have detected sounds that researchers cannot identify or explain through standard lake acoustics. Electromagnetic measurements around Crater Lake have revealed unusual readings that don't align with the area's geological composition. The volcanic rock should produce predictable electromagnetic signatures, but instruments often record values that seem impossible given the known mineral content. These anomalies appear in specific locations around the lake and sometimes correlate with other unexplained phenomena. The National Park Service maintains detailed records of incidents at Crater Lake, including accidents, disappearances, and unusual events. These files document patterns that go beyond normal wilderness dangers. Visitors report disorientation near specific areas of the lake, often describing feeling confused or lost, even on clear days with excellent visibility. Park rangers have documented multiple cases of hikers becoming confused about directions while near the lake's rim. These incidents occur even with experienced outdoors people using GPS devices and detailed maps. The disorientation episodes happen most frequently in certain areas, suggesting localized environmental factors that interfere with normal navigation abilities. Weather monitoring stations around Crater Lake record atmospheric conditions that sometimes don't match regional weather patterns. The lake creates its own microclimate with temperatures and wind patterns that can differ dramatically from surrounding areas. However, some weather events recorded at the lake appear to violate basic meteorological principles. Sudden fog formations occur at Crater Lake with unusual frequency and under conditions where fog shouldn't form. These mists can appear within minutes on clear days, completely obscuring the lake surface. The fog dissipates just as quickly, leaving no trace of the moisture that should remain in the atmosphere. Weather instruments often fail to detect the humidity changes that should accompany such rapid fog formation. Photography at Crater Lake sometimes produces unexpected results that professional photographers cannot explain. Digital cameras occasionally record images showing structures or formations not visible to the naked eye. Film cameras have produced similar anomalous results, ruling out digital processing errors. The unexplained images appear most frequently when photographing specific areas of the lake. Time-lapse photography projects at Crater Lake have captured unusual light phenomena that don't correspond to known astronomical or atmospheric events. These lights appear to move across or above the lake surface in patterns that suggest intelligence or purpose, rather than random natural phenomena. The lights are visible in multiple types of photographic equipment, confirming they aren't equipment artifacts. Scientific diving expeditions in Crater Lake face unusual challenges beyond the extreme depth and cold temperatures. Divers report equipment malfunctions that occur only in certain areas of the lake. Diving computers reset themselves. Underwater lights fail without apparent cause. Communication systems experience interference that doesn't match known sources. The water chemistry of Crater Lake should be relatively simple given its isolated nature and lack of inflow streams. However, chemical analysis sometimes reveals trace elements that shouldn't exist in the lake's closed system. These unusual compounds appear sporadically in water samples, suggesting sources that scientists cannot identify through standard geological processes. Biological studies of Crater Lake have documented unique ecosystems adapted to the lake's extreme conditions. The deep, cold water supports limited but specialized life forms. However, researchers occasionally observe biological activity that doesn't match known species or normal behavioral patterns. Fish appear in areas where the environment shouldn't support them. Plant growth occurs at depths where photosynthesis should be impossible. The lake's impact on electronic equipment extends beyond underwater devices. Visitors frequently report GPS failures, compass malfunctions, and radio interference while near Crater Lake. Park communication systems sometimes experience disruptions that maintenance teams cannot trace to equipment problems or atmospheric conditions. Satellite imagery of Crater Lake occasionally shows features or formations that aren't visible during ground-based observations. These aerial anomalies appear in images from multiple satellites in different time periods, ruling out single equipment failures. When research teams investigate the locations shown in satellite images, they find normal lake features with no explanation for the unusual appearance from above. The volcanic monitoring network around Crater Lake sometimes records signals that don't match known volcanic or seismic activity. These readings suggest subsurface movements or processes that current geological models cannot explain. The signals occur in patterns that seem too regular to be random natural phenomena. Long-term temperature monitoring has revealed thermal cycles in Crater Lake that don't correlate with seasonal changes, solar activity, or known geothermal processes. The water temperature variations follow patterns that suggest external influences not accounted for in current scientific understanding of the lake's thermal dynamics. Research into Crater Lake's Mysteries continues with increasingly sophisticated instruments and techniques. Each new study answers some questions while raising others. The lake's documented geological processes explain many of its features, but significant phenomena remain beyond current scientific understanding. The boundary between known science and unexplained
Mystery continues to shift as researchers
gather more data about this remarkable and puzzling natural wonder. Shenandoah's vanished hikers. The ancient ridges of Shenandoah National Park rise like sleeping giants along Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains. For nearly a century, millions have walked these trails, finding peace in forests that predate human memory. But tucked away in ranger station files are investigations that tell a different story. Cases where the mountains' embrace became something far more sinister, and searches that stretched the limits of human endurance only to end in heartbreak. April 22, 2021 started as a perfect spring evening in Shenandoah. The dogwoods were blooming white against the green hillsides, and hikers filled the trails to catch the season's first warm weather. Ty Sauer, an 18-year-old from Union Beach, New Jersey, had driven down with friends for a camping trip. They planned to spend a few days exploring the park before heading home. At 11:47 p.m., Ty's friends called Shenandoah National Park rangers with an urgent report. Tired, left their campsite near Skyland Resort around 10:30 p.m., saying he needed some air and wanted to walk around. He had been gone for over an hour, and they were getting worried. The young man wasn't answering his phone, and they couldn't find him anywhere near their camping area. Ranger Jennifer Martinez took the initial report over the radio. Ty was described as 5'10" in tall with brown hair and wearing a grey sweatshirt and jeans. His friends said he wasn't an experienced hiker, but he also wasn't the type to wander far from familiar areas. Martinez immediately began organizing a preliminary search of the immediate vicinity. By midnight, 3 rangers were combing the area around Skyland Resort with flashlights. They called Ty's name continuously, their voices echoing off the surrounding ridges. The rangers checked all the overlooks, parking areas, and nearby trails. They found no trace of the missing teenager. His phone was going straight to voicemail, suggesting it was either turned off or had lost power. At 1:15 a.m. on April 23rd, Park Superintendent Patrick Kenny made the decision to escalate the search. The Virginia Department of Emergency Management was contacted, and additional ranger units were dispatched from other areas of the park. The initial missing person report became a full-scale search and rescue operation. Dawn brought clearer visibility, but no sign of Ty Sauer. By 6 a.m., over 20 searchers were deployed across a grid pattern extending outward from Skyland Resort. The search teams included park rangers, Virginia State Police, and volunteers from local rescue squads. Each team carried radios and GPS units to coordinate their movements and mark areas they had covered. The first major clue came at 7:45 a.m. when Ranger Thomas Chen found Ty's cell phone on a trail about half a mile from the resort. The phone was lying on the ground near the Appalachian Trail crossing, its battery completely dead. There were no other personal items visible in the area, and no signs of a struggle or accident. Search Coordinator Captain Robert Hayes from Virginia Emergency Management arrived at 9 a.m. to take overall command of the operation. Hayes had 23 years of experience in wilderness search and rescue, including multiple operations in Shenandoah's challenging terrain. He immediately expanded the search area to include steep ravines and difficult terrain where someone might have fallen or become lost. By noon on April 23rd, the search had grown to include 37 people divided into 6 teams. Each team was assigned specific sectors based on the most likely paths Ty might have taken from the resort. Virginia State Police deployed a helicopter to search from above, focusing on areas too difficult for ground teams to access quickly. The helicopter crew reported several potential sightings during their first sweep, but ground teams checking these locations found only fallen logs, rocks, or shadows that had appeared to be a person from above. The dense forest canopy made aerial searching extremely difficult, as most of the ground remained hidden beneath layers of leaves and branches. At 2:30 p.m., search dogs arrived from the Virginia Search and Rescue Dog Association. The German Shepherds and Bloodhounds were given articles of Ty's clothing to establish his scent. The dogs immediately picked up a trail leading from the resort area toward the Appalachian Trail, confirming the path indicated by the location of his cell phone. The scent trail led the dogs along the Appalachian Trail for approximately 1 mile before they lost it near a rocky outcropping. The handlers tried repeatedly to reacquire the scent, but the dogs showed no interest in any particular direction from that point. The trail had simply ended. Saturday, April 24th, brought additional resources to the search. The Virginia National Guard provided a specialized search and rescue team with advanced equipment. Local volunteer groups arrived with all-terrain vehicles to cover more ground quickly. The total number of searchers reached nearly 60 people. Weather became a factor as afternoon thunderstorms rolled through the area. The rain made searching more difficult and dangerous, particularly on the steep slopes and rocky areas where Ty might have fallen. Search operations were temporarily suspended during the heaviest downpours, then resumed as soon as conditions allowed. On Sunday, April 25th, the FBI joined the investigation. While there was no evidence of foul play, the Bureau's resources were requested to help coordinate the increasingly complex search operation. FBI agents began interviewing Ty's friends and family members to develop a better understanding of his mental state and possible motivations for leaving the campsite. The interviews revealed that Ty had been dealing with some personal issues related to his plans after high school graduation. Friends described him as sometimes withdrawn, but they insisted he'd never expressed thoughts of self-harm. His parents drove down from New Jersey and provided additional information about their son's hiking experience and outdoor skills. Monday, April 26th, marked the 5th day of searching. The operation had covered over 15 square miles of rugged terrain. Teams had searched every trail, stream bed, and accessible ravine within a reasonable distance of where Ty was last seen. Advanced search techniques included thermal imaging cameras and ground-penetrating radar in areas where a body might be hidden beneath fallen leaves or debris. At 2:55 p.m. on Monday, the search reached its conclusion. Team leader Sergeant Mike Rodriguez was leading a group through a steep ravine about 2 meters southwest of Skyland Resort when they discovered human remains. The body was partially hidden beneath fallen branches and leaves in an area that previous search teams had not been able to access due to the dangerous terrain. Virginia State Police immediately secured the scene. While the medical examiner was contacted, the remains were consistent with Ty Sauer's description, but formal identification would require additional examination. The location where the body was found was not visible from any trail and would have been extremely difficult to reach, especially in darkness. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the state medical examiner, arrived at 4:30 p.m. to supervise the recovery of the remains. The process took several hours due to the challenging terrain and the need to preserve evidence. Every detail of the scene was photographed and documented before the body was carefully removed. The preliminary examination suggested that Ty had suffered injuries consistent with a fall from height. The location of the body at the bottom of a steep ravine supported this theory. However, several questions remained about how he'd reached such a remote area, particularly given his unfamiliarity with the park's trail system. Autopsy results released 2 weeks later confirmed that Tyau had died from injuries sustained in a fall. The medical examiner found no evidence of foul play or substance abuse. The official cause of death was ruled accidental, though investigators were unable to determine exactly how Ty had reached the location where his body was found. The investigation revealed several puzzling aspects of the case. Ty had somehow traveled over Tuimi from the resort through extremely difficult terrain, much of it without any established trails. The route would have required navigation skills and local knowledge that he did not possess. The path also led away from all the areas his friends expected him to explore. Search and rescue officials conducted a detailed review of their procedures and coverage. They determined that the area where Ty's body was found had been identified early in the search, but was considered too dangerous for immediate exploration. The steep terrain and unstable rock formations had required specialized equipment and experienced climbers to access safely. The case highlighted ongoing challenges faced by search and rescue operations in Shenandoah National Park. The park's 200,000 acres include some of the most rugged terrain on the east coast, with numerous areas that are difficult or impossible to search quickly, where the darkness and the thick forest canopy all complicate rescue efforts. Park officials used the Thai sources to improve their search protocols and training procedures. New guidelines were established for accessing dangerous terrain more quickly, and additional resources were allocated for night search operations. The goal was to reduce response times while maintaining searcher safety. The Sauer family established a memorial fund to support search and rescue training in Shenandoah National Park. Their statement emphasized their gratitude for the efforts of all the searchers and their hope that improved techniques might help other families facing similar tragedies. The investigation file for Taiao's disappearance runs to over 300 pages, documenting every aspect of the search and the subsequent investigation. We've looked at cases where people entered fog and something went wrong. Pilots who lost time, ships found empty, hikers who vanished completely. All documented, all real, all unexplained. The investigators did their jobs, the search teams did theirs. The evidence was collected. The reports were filed. The cases were closed, but the answers never came. The fog hasn't stopped.
Neither have the disappearances.
These cases prove that no matter how much we think we understand the world, there are still things out there we can't explain, and things that happen when ordinary people walk into ordinary fog and find themselves somewhere impossible